Margaret Ellis clutched her niece tighter as the stagecoach vanished into desert dust, leaving her stranded in Arizona territory with nothing but broken promises and a crying baby. Her mail-order husband had disappeared, sold everything, and fled west like a coward. No money, no plan, no hope. Then a stranger's voice cut through her despair. "Ma'am, you look like you could use some help." She turned to face the cowboy whose kindness would either save her life or break her heart. Want to know how this abandoned bride found her way home? Stay until the end and comment which city you're watching from so I can see how far Margaret's story travels across the world. The Arizona sun hammered down on Copper Creek like God's own anvil, turning the dusty main street into a shimmering ribbon of heat that made the wooden storefronts dance and blur. Margaret Ellis stood alone on the weathered boardwalk outside the stage depot, her threadbare traveling dress already soaked with perspiration, her arms aching from the weight of 6-month-old Clara, who squirmed and whimpered against her shoulder. The baby's cries seemed to echo off every building, announcing their desperate situation to anyone within earshot. Margaret's heart pounded as she scanned the handful of people moving along the street, a shopkeeper sweeping his porch, 2 cowboys leading horses toward the livery, an older woman carrying a basket of laundry. None of them paid her any attention. None of them were Peter Anderson, the man whose letters had promised her a new life, a home, a future worth crossing half the continent to claim. "Ma'am?" The stagecoach driver, a grizzled man named Horace with tobacco-stained whiskers, cleared his throat apologetically. "I got to move along. Schedule to keep." Margaret turned to him, fighting to keep the tremor out of her voice. "You're certain there's no mistake, no message left for me?" Horace shifted uncomfortably, his weathered face creasing with something that might have been pity. "Asked around while you was tending to the little one. Far as anyone knows, Peter Anderson sold his ranch to the Morrisons back in March, 3, maybe 4 months ago. Headed west toward California, they say. Left a pile of debts behind him, from what I hear." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. March. He'd written to her in April, promising everything. The ranch, the wedding, the life they'd build together. She'd sold her mother's silver tea service, the last valuable thing she owned, to pay for the journey west. She'd bundled up Clara, her deceased sister's baby, and traveled for 3 weeks across mountains and prairies to get here. And all of it, every word of Peter Anderson's letters, had been lies. "Ma'am?" Horace pressed gently. "You got people here? Someone expecting you?" "No." The word came out as barely a whisper. Margaret straightened her shoulders, forcing steel into her spine. "No, I'll manage. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Horace." The driver hesitated, clearly unconvinced, but finally tipped his hat and climbed back onto his coach. Within moments, the stagecoach was rolling away down the dusty street, leaving Margaret truly, utterly alone. Clara's cries intensified, her little face red and scrunched with misery. The baby was hungry. Margaret could feel it in the desperate way she rooted against her shoulder. But Margaret's own milk had dried up weeks ago during the stressful journey, and the last of the canned milk she'd brought from Boston was gone. She needed to buy supplies. She needed to find lodging. She needed to figure out how to survive long enough to make a plan. Her reticule felt impossibly light on her wrist. Inside were $3.47, every penny she had left in the world. Enough for perhaps 2 nights at a boarding house, if she was lucky. After that, Margaret refused to finish the thought. She bounced Clara gently, trying to soothe her, and started walking toward what looked like a general store. The boardwalk creaked under her feet, and she was painfully aware of how she must look, rumpled and travel-worn, clutching a screaming infant, desperation written across every line of her face. The store was dim and blessedly cool inside. Behind the counter, a barrel-chested man with impressive mutton chops looked up from his ledger. His expression shifted from mild curiosity to poorly concealed wariness as he took in Margaret and the crying baby. "Help you, miss?" "I need—" Margaret's voice cracked. She swallowed hard and tried again. "I need canned milk for the baby. And I'm looking for lodging. Is there a boarding house in town?" The shopkeeper's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mrs. Kimball runs a respectable place 2 streets over. Yellow house with green shutters. Can't miss it." He paused, then added with unmistakable emphasis, She runs a respectable place. Don't take in just anybody." The implication stung like a slap. Margaret felt her cheeks burn. "I assure you, sir, Mama's milk's always best," the shopkeeper interrupted, eyeing Clara with disapproval. "Baby that age shouldn't be on no bottle." Shame flooded through Margaret, hot and bitter. "Her mother died," she said quietly, firmly. "I'm doing the best I can." Something in the man's face softened marginally. He grunted and turned to his shelves. "Got 2 tins of Nestle's, $1.50 each." $3, almost everything she had. But Clara's screams had become desperate, heart-wrenching. Margaret nodded. "I'll take 1 tin, please." As the shopkeeper wrapped the tin in brown paper, Margaret became aware of voices outside. Male voices, rough and loud with drink despite the early hour. "Look at that fine piece that just got off the stage," one voice drawled. "All alone, from what I hear. Anderson's mail-order bride, they say. But Anderson ain't here no more, is he?" Coarse laughter followed. Margaret's hands trembled as she counted out her precious coins onto the counter. "You want some advice, miss?" The shopkeeper's voice had dropped lower. "Get yourself to Mrs. Kimball's quick, and don't go wandering around town after dark. Copper Creek's got some rough elements, especially come evening." Margaret nodded mutely, scooping up the wrapped tin and turning toward the door. Through the dusty window, she could see 3 men lounging against a hitching post outside. Cowboys or drifters? It was hard to tell. One of them caught sight of her and elbowed his companion, grinning. Her stomach clenched with fear. She pushed through the door into the blazing heat, keeping her eyes down, walking as quickly as she could while still maintaining some dignity. Clara had exhausted herself crying and now lay limply against Margaret's shoulder, making small, pitiful mewing sounds that broke her heart. "Hey there, pretty lady," one of the men called out. "You lost? Need some help finding your way?" Margaret ignored him, her heart hammering. The yellow house with green shutters. She just had to find it. "Ain't polite to ignore a friendly greeting," another voice called, and she heard footsteps behind her. Panic surged through her veins. The street seemed endless, shimmering with heat, every building the same weathered brown. Where was the boarding house? Her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. "Ma'am," a different voice this time, quieter, closer, but somehow less threatening. "You look like you could use a hand." Margaret stopped and turned, ready to deliver a sharp rebuke, but the words died on her lips. The man standing beside her was tall, very tall, with broad shoulders and sun-browned skin that spoke of years working under the desert sky. He wore simple ranch clothes, worn denim pants, a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, a dusty brown hat tilted back from his forehead. But it was his eyes that stopped her, steady, dark, infinitely kind eyes that held none of the leering speculation she'd seen from the men behind her. "I'm Jack Carter," he said simply, touching the brim of his hat. "I ranch about 15 miles north of town. I don't mean to intrude, but you look—" He paused, seeming to search for diplomatic words. "Like maybe you've had a difficult day." Something about his quiet, matter-of-fact tone broke through Margaret's defenses. Or maybe it was simply that she had nothing left. No energy to maintain pride, no resources to keep pretending she had any control over her situation. "I'm looking for Mrs. Kimball's boarding house," she said, hating how her voice shook. "The shopkeeper said it was on this street, but Yellow house with green shutters, that'd be it. 3 buildings down on the right." Jack Carter's gaze moved past her to the men who'd been following, and something in his expression shifted, not anger exactly, but a quiet, unmistakable warning. "Afternoon, Garrett. Slim, you boys heading out to the Morrison place?" The atmosphere changed instantly. The men who'd been calling out to Margaret suddenly found other things to look at. "Just passing time, Jack," one of them muttered. "No harm meant." "I'm sure," Jack said mildly. Then he turned back to Margaret, and his voice gentled again. "I'd be happy to walk you over to Mrs. Kimball's, ma'am. Make sure you get there safely." Margaret wanted to refuse. She barely knew this man, and accepting help from strangers had already proven disastrous, but Clara chose that moment to let out another thin wail, and Margaret felt her resolve crumble. "Thank you," she whispered. "That would be— Thank you." They walked side by side down the dusty street, Jack Carter maintaining a respectful distance. He didn't pepper her with questions or make awkward conversation. He simply walked beside her, a steady, calming presence that made the hostile town feel fractionally less overwhelming. Clara continued to whimper, and Margaret could feel the baby's distress radiating through her thin blanket. She'd been such a good baby during most of the journey, but the heat and hunger were too much for her tiny body to bear. "How old?" Jack asked, nodding toward Clara. 6 months. Margaret swallowed hard. "She's my niece. My sister died in childbirth." "I'm sorry." 2 simple words, but they carried genuine sympathy. That's a heavy thing to bear. They reached the yellow house with its faded green shutters. The small yard was neat, with a few determined flowers struggling to bloom in the harsh climate. Jack stepped ahead to knock on the door. A woman in her 50s answered, thin, sharp-eyed, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. She looked Margaret up and down with the assessing gaze of someone who'd learned to evaluate character quickly and rarely changed her mind. "Mrs. Kimball," Jack said politely. "This lady's new to town and needs lodging. I was hoping you might have a room available." Mrs. Kimball's expression was skeptical. "I run a respectable house, Mr. Carter. I don't take in just anyone off the street." "I can assure you, ma'am, I'm quite respectable," Margaret said, forcing strength into her voice. "I'm a widow, and she's Anderson's mail-order bride," someone called from across the street, one of the men from earlier, grinning maliciously. "But Anderson ain't here no more, is he?" Margaret's cheeks flamed. Mrs. Kimball's lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "I see," the landlady said coldly. "Well, I'm afraid—" "Actually," Jack Carter interrupted, his voice still quiet but carrying unmistakable authority, "this lady is a friend of my family's. She's come west to help care for my sister's children, and she'll be staying at my ranch starting tomorrow. She just needs a room for tonight." Margaret's head whipped around to stare at him. What was he doing? Mrs. Kimball's expression shifted immediately. Jack Carter might be young, but everyone in Copper Creek knew the Carters, solid, respectable ranching family, been in the territory since before Arizona broke from New Mexico. If Jack Carter vouched for someone, that meant something. "Well," Mrs. Kimball said, her tone warming marginally, "if that's the case, I suppose I can accommodate the lady for one night. That'll be $1. $1. Margaret's mind raced. That would leave her with only $1.47, but what choice did she have? "Thank you," she said quietly, digging into her reticule for the precious coin. Inside, Mrs. Kimball's boarding house was clean and sparse. The landlady led Margaret up a narrow staircase to a small room under the eaves, just big enough for a narrow bed, a washstand, and a plain wooden chair. But it had a door that locked, and after weeks of sleeping in stagecoach stations and questionable wayside inns, it felt like luxury. "Supper's at 6, Mrs. Kimball said crisply. "Breakfast at 7. No men allowed upstairs and no noise after 9. I keep a Christian house." "Of course. Thank you, Mrs. Kimball." When the landlady left, Margaret sank onto the bed. Clara still clutched against her chest. Her whole body was shaking, with exhaustion, with relief, with the crushing weight of her situation. She looked down at the baby, whose tiny face was red and tear-streaked, her rosebud mouth working desperately. "I know, sweetheart," Margaret whispered, tears finally spilling down her own cheeks. "I know you're hungry. Let's get you fed, all right?" She managed to mix up a bottle of the canned milk, testing the temperature on her wrist the way her sister had taught her. Clara latched onto it desperately, her little hands coming up to grip the bottle, her eyes drifting closed with relief as she finally got the sustenance she needed. Margaret sat on the edge of the narrow bed, watching Clara drink, and let herself cry, quietly, so no one would hear, but deeply, releasing some of the terror and uncertainty that had been building for weeks. What was she going to do? Where would she go? How would she and Clara survive? And what had Jack Carter meant by his lie to Mrs. Kimball? Why would he involve himself in her problems? As if summoned by her thoughts, a soft knock came at the door. Margaret quickly wiped her eyes and stood, still holding Clara. Jack Carter stood in the hallway, his hat in his hands. Behind him, Mrs. Kimball hovered disapprovingly. Clearly, she'd insisted on chaperoning this conversation. "I apologize for taking liberties with your situation," Jack said formally, "but Mrs. Kimball wasn't going to give you a room otherwise, and—" He paused, seeming to struggle for words. Well, it wasn't right. I appreciate your help, Margaret said carefully, though I'm afraid your generosity has put me in an awkward position. I have no intention of going to anyone's ranch tomorrow, and when Mrs. Kimball discovers that— Actually, Jack interrupted gently, I was hoping you might consider it. Margaret blinked at him, confused. Jack cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable but determined. Look, I know you don't know me from Adam, and I'm sure you've got your reasons for coming west and your own plans for what comes next. But here's the truth. I've got a ranch 15 miles north of here. It's not much, but it's mine clear. No debt, no mortgage. Got a spare room that hasn't been used in years. Got food enough for 3 people easy, maybe 4. And he glanced at Clara, who had finally fallen asleep, the empty bottle slipping from her slack lips. Got space for a baby to be safe and cared for while you figure out what you want to do. I couldn't possibly. No obligations, Jack said quickly. No expectations. You stay as long as you need. A week, a month, whatever it takes for you to get your feet under you. I won't. He seemed to be choosing his words very carefully, aware of Mrs. Kimball listening to every syllable. I won't bother you none. Won't expect anything from you, just offering a safe place to catch your breath. Margaret stared at him, her mind spinning. This was insane. She didn't know this man. He could be anyone, want anything. She'd be completely at his mercy, miles from town with no way to call for help. But the alternative was what? The $1.47 in her reticule wouldn't last another day. She had no prospects, no plan, no options. And Clara needed stability, safety, consistent meals. Margaret couldn't provide any of that on her own. Why would you help me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't know me. Jack was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and honest. My mama died when I was 20. Fever took her and my pa both in the same week. I was left alone with a ranch to run and no idea what I was doing. Folks in Copper Creek helped me, brought food, taught me what I needed to know, never asked for anything in return. Said that's just what neighbors do. Maybe— He met her eyes squarely. Maybe I'm just paying that kindness forward. In the hallway, even Mrs. Kimball's stern expression had softened slightly. Margaret looked down at Clara, sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. She thought about her empty reticule, her lack of options, the jeering men on the street. She thought about how Jack Carter had stepped between her and trouble without being asked, how he'd given her away into this boarding house when Mrs. Kimball would have turned her away. She thought about the absolute terror of having no plan and no hope. All right, she heard herself say. Just until I can make other arrangements. Jack's whole face relaxed with relief. That's fine, that's real fine. I'll come by in the morning, say 8 o'clock, with the wagon. We can get you settled in proper. After he left, Margaret sat back down on the narrow bed, Clara warm and heavy in her arms. Mrs. Kimball lingered in the doorway. Jack Carter's a good man, the landlady said grudgingly. Lost both his parents young, like he said, and kept that ranch going through sheer stubborn work. Never caused trouble, always pays his debts. If he says you'll be safe, you'll be safe. It wasn't quite an apology for her earlier coldness, but it was something. Margaret nodded her thanks, and Mrs. Kimball left, closing the door softly behind her. Alone again, Margaret let out a shaky breath. She'd just agreed to go home with a complete stranger, to live on his isolated ranch with no one around for miles. It was either the smartest decision she'd made since leaving Boston or the most foolish. Only time would tell which. That evening, Margaret took supper in Mrs. Kimball's dining room, a simple meal of beef stew and cornbread served at a long table with 3 other boarders, all men. They nodded politely but didn't attempt conversation, for which Margaret was grateful. She was too exhausted for small talk, too wrung out emotionally to maintain the careful facade of composure. Clara had woken up cranky from her nap, and Margaret spent most of the meal bouncing the baby on her knee while trying to eat one-handed. The other boarders cast occasional annoyed glances at the baby's fussing, making Margaret's cheeks burn with embarrassment. "How old's your little one?" Mrs. Kimball asked as she cleared the plates, her tone slightly warmer than it had been earlier. 6 months, Margaret said, shifting Clara to her other knee. She's usually better behaved than this. The journey was hard on her. Mrs. Kimball made a non-committal sound. Babies are always hard. That's why the good Lord makes them small, so they're easier to carry when you're ready to throw them out the window. It took Margaret a moment to realize the severe woman had made a joke. A small, surprised laugh escaped her. Get some rest tonight, Mrs. Kimball continued, her expression softening further. Jack will be here bright and early, I expect. He's not one for dawdling. Back in her room, Margaret gave Clara another bottle. The baby drank greedily, her small hands wrapping around Margaret's fingers, and then changed her into a clean nightgown. The room was stifling despite the opened window, and Margaret could hear the sounds of Copper Creek settling in for the night, horses whinnying in the livery, piano music drifting from what was probably a saloon, men's voices raised in laughter or argument. She laid Clara in the center of the narrow bed, building a protective wall of rolled blankets on either side so the baby wouldn't roll off. Clara stared up at her with those wide, innocent eyes, her sister's eyes, and Margaret felt her heart clench with love and terror in equal measure. We're going to be all right, she whispered, stroking the baby's downy hair. I promise you, Clara. We're going to figure this out. Clara yawned enormously, her tiny fist stretching above her head, and then her eyes drifted closed. Within moments, she was asleep, her rosebud mouth slightly open, utterly trusting and peaceful. Margaret changed into her nightgown and lay down beside the baby, careful not to disturb her. Through the thin walls, she could hear one of the other boarders snoring, and somewhere below, Mrs. Kimball's footsteps as she made her final rounds of the evening. Margaret stared at the ceiling, her mind refusing to quiet despite her body's exhaustion. Tomorrow she would leave this town with a man she didn't know, traveling to a place she'd never seen. She would be completely dependent on Jack Carter's goodwill and honesty, trusting a stranger because she had no other choice. It was terrifying. It was also, she realized, the first glimmer of hope she'd felt since stepping off that stagecoach. Jack Carter had kind eyes. He'd stepped between her and trouble without hesitation. He'd given her away into this boarding house when Mrs. Kimball would have turned her away. And he'd offered her sanctuary, not with the expectation of payment or obligation, but simply because she needed it and he could provide it. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that had to be enough. Margaret closed her eyes and for the first time in weeks, allowed herself to hope that morning might bring something better than disaster. But true to Mrs. Kimball's prediction, Jack Carter arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, driving a sturdy wagon pulled by a pair of patient-looking horses. Margaret had been awake since dawn, feeding Clara and packing the few belongings she'd brought west. 2 changes of clothes, a hairbrush, her mother's Bible, and a small daguerreotype of her sister holding baby Clara just days before she died. Everything she owned in the world fit in a single worn carpet bag. Jack helped her up onto the wagon seat with surprising gentleness, then secured her bag in the back alongside what looked like supplies from the general store. Margaret noticed he'd purchased an additional tin of canned milk, along with flour, sugar, and coffee. Practical purchases for a working ranch. It's about 2 hours to my place, Jack said, as he climbed up beside her and took the reins. Road's decent most of the way. If the baby needs to stop, just say so. Margaret nodded, settling Clara more securely on her lap. The baby was alert this morning, her big eyes taking in everything with solemn curiosity. They rolled out of Copper Creek just as the town was coming to life. Shopkeepers opening their doors, a group of cowboys heading out for the day's work. A few people watched them leave, and Margaret could feel their speculative gazes following the wagon. No doubt by evening, everyone in town would be discussing Jack Carter and the mysterious woman he'd taken home. The scandal of it should have bothered her more than it did. But Margaret had learned over the past 24 hours that survival mattered more than reputation. Once they left town behind, the landscape opened up into vast stretches of desert punctuated by scrubby brush and distant mesas. The morning air was still relatively cool, though Margaret could already feel the promise of brutal heat in the climbing sun. The wagon wheels crunched over the packed dirt road, and the rhythmic clip-clop of the horses' hooves created a soothing pattern. Jack didn't try to fill the silence with unnecessary chatter, for which Margaret was grateful. She found herself studying him surreptitiously. The strong line of his jaw, the way his hands held the reins with easy competence, the small scar above his left eyebrow that looked old and well-healed. He had the build of someone who worked hard physically every day, but there was a gentleness in how he'd helped her into the wagon. how his eyes had softened when looking at Clara. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret said finally, breaking the comfortable quiet. "Yes, ma'am." "Why did you really offer to help me? The truth, please, not the story about your parents, though I'm sure that's true too." Jack was silent for a long moment, his eyes on the road ahead. "You remember I said my parents died when I was 20? Yes. What I didn't mention was that my sister was 17 at the time, Sarah. She'd been planning to marry a boy from town, Tom Wheeler, nice enough fellow. But after Ma and Pa died, Tom's family decided they didn't want Sarah marrying into a situation with no prospects. Told Tom to break it off, find a girl with better circumstances." Jack's jaw tightened. "So he did. Just like that." Sarah was heartbroken. Margaret felt her chest tighten with sympathy. "Neighbors helped us through that first year," Jack continued. "Taught me what I needed to know about running a ranch. Sarah kept house, and between us we managed. Then she met a prospector passing through, fellow named Daniel Frost. Good man, hardworking, honest. They fell in love, got married, moved to Colorado to try their luck in the mining camps. You must miss her." "Every day." Jack glanced at Margaret, his expression serious. "But here's the thing. When I saw you yesterday, standing on that street with that baby, looking like the whole world had turned its back on you, all I could think was, what if that had been Sarah? What if she'd needed help and no one stepped up? What if she'd been alone and scared with no one to turn to?" Understanding dawned. "So you helped me because you'd want someone to help your sister." "Something like that." Jack returned his attention to the road. "Plus, you looked like you were about 2 minutes from collapsing, and that baby was screaming loud enough to wake the dead. Seemed like the decent thing to do." Despite everything, Margaret felt a smile tug at her lips. "Well, thank you. For being decent." "You're welcome." They rode in silence for a while longer. Clara began to fuss, and Margaret tried bouncing her gently, but the baby's complaints grew louder. Finally, Jack pulled the wagon to a stop beside a cluster of rocks that provided a small patch of shade. "Take your time," he said, hopping down and then helping Margaret to the ground. "I'll water the horses." Margaret found a relatively clean rock to sit on and prepared a bottle for Clara, who latched onto it desperately. While the baby ate, Margaret watched Jack unhitch a water bucket and let the horses drink from it, talking to them in a low, soothing voice. He moved with the easy confidence of someone completely comfortable with animals and the land. "You said you've been ranching since you were 20? Margaret called over. "Yep, 5 years now." Jack finished with the horses and ambled over, settling onto a nearby rock at a respectful distance. "Wasn't easy at first, made plenty of mistakes, but the land's good. Got a spring-fed creek running through my property, enough grazing for a decent herd. Built it up slow and steady." "And you run it all by yourself?" "Mostly. Sometimes hire a hand during roundup, but day to day it's just me." He paused. "Gets quiet sometimes." There was something in his voice, not quite loneliness, but maybe the echo of it. Margaret understood that feeling all too well. She'd been lonely in Boston too, even before her sister died. Lonely in the cramped boarding house where she'd worked as a seamstress. Lonely in the small apartment she'd shared with her sister during those final difficult months of pregnancy. Sometimes loneliness followed you no matter where you went. Clara finished her bottle and let out a satisfied burp that made Jack laugh, a warm, genuine sound that transformed his serious face into something younger and more carefree. "She's got good lungs on her," he observed. "You have no idea," Margaret said dryly. "Wait until she's really upset." They got back on the wagon and continued north. The landscape gradually shifted from flat desert to rolling hills dotted with more substantial vegetation. Margaret saw cattle grazing in the distance, their rust-colored hides blending with the dusty earth. Hawks circled overhead, riding the thermal currents, and once Jack pointed out a family of quail scurrying across the road ahead of them. "There," Jack said finally, pointing toward a cluster of buildings nestled in a small valley. "That's home." Margaret's first impression was one of surprised approval. She'd been expecting something more ramshackle, a crude cabin, maybe, the sort of rough bachelor quarters she'd heard about in frontier stories. Instead, Jack's ranch looked well-maintained and thoughtfully laid out. The main house was single-story but substantial, built from weathered wood with a wide front porch that would provide shade during the brutal summer afternoons. Nearby stood a barn in good repair, a corral with sturdy fencing, and what looked like a chicken coop. Everything was neat and orderly. No trash littering the yard, no broken equipment rusting in the sun. "It's not fancy," Jack said, and Margaret detected a note of apology in his voice. "But it's solid. Roof doesn't leak. Walls are tight against the cold." "It's lovely," Margaret said honestly, and saw surprise flicker across his face. As they pulled up to the house, a large dog emerged from the barn, some mix of shepherd and hound, with a graying muzzle that spoke of advancing age. The dog barked once, then recognized Jack and transformed into a wagging, wiggling mass of enthusiasm. "That's Bear," Jack said, his voice warm with affection. "He's old and lazy, but he's good company. Won't hurt the baby. He's gentle as they come." Margaret watched Jack crouch down to greet the dog, accepting enthusiastic licks to his face with good-natured laughter. The picture they made, rough cowboy and loving dog, did more to ease her lingering fears than any words could have. Jack helped her down from the wagon and then led her toward the house, Bear trailing behind them with curious sniffs at Margaret's skirts. The front door wasn't locked. Apparently Jack trusted his isolation to keep out intruders, and he pushed it open with a slight hesitation that made Margaret realize he was nervous about her judgment. Inside, the house was clean. Surprisingly, impressively clean. Margaret had braced herself for bachelor squalor, dirty dishes, unmade bed, general chaos, but instead found a tidy front room with simple furniture that looked handmade but sturdy. A wood stove in the corner, a table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair near the window. The wooden floor was swept, and someone, Jack presumably, had even made an attempt at curtains, though they hung slightly crooked. "Kitchen's through there," Jack said, pointing to a doorway. "My room's in back. Spare room's here." He opened a door off the main living space, revealing a small bedroom with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a single window looking out toward the barn. "I know it's not much, but the mattress is good. I made it myself last year when the old one gave out. Replaced the straw just last month, so it should be comfortable enough." Margaret stepped into the room, Clara dozing on her shoulder. The space was simple but clean, and most importantly, it felt safe. No leering men, no hostile landlady, no crushing weight of having absolutely nowhere else to go. "It's perfect," she said quietly. "Thank you, Mr. Carter." "Jack," he corrected gently. "No need for formality out here." "Then you must call me Margaret." He smiled, a small, genuine smile that made his whole face soften. "Margaret it is." He cleared his throat, suddenly looking uncomfortable again. I'll bring in your things and let you get settled. If you need anything, just holler. I'll be out tending to the horses and checking on the herd." He left, pulling the door partially closed behind him, and Margaret heard him moving around in the main room, then the sound of the front door opening and closing. She was alone, truly alone, for the first time since leaving Boston weeks ago. Margaret sank onto the bed, Clara still sleeping against her shoulder, and let out a long, shaky breath. The bed was indeed comfortable, the room cool despite the rising heat outside. Through the window, she could see Jack unhitching the horses from the wagon, moving with that same easy competence he brought to everything. This was her reality now. She was living on a stranger's ranch, dependent on his continued goodwill, with no plan and no prospects for the future. It should have terrified her more than it did. Instead, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Margaret felt something that might have been the beginning of hope. Margaret spent the first hour unpacking her meager belongings and trying to make the small room feel like her own. She folded her 2 spare dresses into the dresser, placed her mother's Bible on the windowsill where the morning light would fall across it, and positioned the daguerreotype of her sister on top of the dresser where she could see it first thing each morning. Clara, miraculously, stayed asleep on the bed, her tiny chest rising and falling with peaceful regularity. Through the window, Margaret could see Jack working in the corral with one of the horses, a young chestnut mare that seemed skittish and uncertain. He moved slowly, speaking in that low, calm voice she'd heard him use before, his hands gentle as he ran them along the horse's neck and flanks. The mare gradually settled under his touch, her ears swiveling forward with interest rather than back with fear. Margaret found herself mesmerized by the scene. There was something almost hypnotic about watching Jack work. The patience he demonstrated, the quiet confidence, the way he seemed to understand exactly what the animal needed without force or harshness. She'd grown up in Boston, where horses were simply transportation, beaten into submission if they didn't comply. This was entirely different. A soft knock on her door pulled her attention away from the window. "Margaret, I'm heading out to check the cattle, but I wanted to show you around the kitchen first. If you're hungry, that is." She opened the door to find Jack standing there, hat in hand, looking uncertain again. Bear sat beside him, tail thumping hopefully against the floor. "That would be helpful, thank you." The kitchen was larger than she'd expected, with a cast-iron stove that looked well-maintained, a deep sink with a hand pump, and shelves lined with canned goods and dry staples. A window over the sink looked out toward the creek Jack had mentioned, and Margaret could see the shimmer of water between the cottonwood trees. "I'm not much of a cook," Jack admitted, opening one of the cupboards. "Mostly I stick to simple things: beans, bacon, cornbread. Coffee's always on the stove if you want it. Help yourself to whatever you need." He paused, then added almost shyly, "If you felt like making something for supper, I'd be grateful. But there's no obligation. You're a guest here, not hired help." "I'd be happy to cook," Margaret said, and realized she meant it. After weeks of eating whatever she could afford at wayside stations, stale bread, questionable stew, weak tea, the thought of preparing a proper meal felt almost therapeutic. "I'm actually quite a good cook. My mother insisted on it." Jack's face brightened. "Then I'm in for a treat. It's been 5 years since I've had anything that wasn't made by my own clumsy hands." He grabbed a battered hat from a peg by the door. "I should be back by late afternoon. If you need anything before then, ring the bell on the porch. I'll hear it from anywhere on the property." After he left, Margaret spent some time exploring the kitchen more thoroughly. Jack hadn't exaggerated about his limited cooking skills. The pots and pans showed signs of hard use and occasional burning, and his spice selection consisted of salt, pepper, and not much else. But the basics were there, and she'd worked with less during the lean years in Boston. Clara woke up hungry and cranky, and Margaret spent the next hour feeding her, changing her, and walking her around the house to calm her fussing. The baby seemed to sense the change in their circumstances, the quiet, the space, the absence of jostling stagecoaches and crowded boarding houses, and gradually her tension eased. By noon, she was cooing and reaching for dust motes dancing in the sunlight streaming through the windows. "This might actually work," Margaret whispered to her, settling into the rocking chair with Clara on her lap. "We might actually be safe here." Bear patted over and laid his graying head on Margaret's knee, looking up at her with soulful brown eyes. She tentatively stroked his soft ears, and his tail began to thump with approval. Within minutes, she had a sleeping baby in her arms and a contented dog at her feet, and the combination did something to ease the constant knot of anxiety that had lived in her chest for weeks. That afternoon, Margaret took stock of the supplies and planned a proper meal. She found dried beans that she set to soaking, discovered a precious jar of preserved tomatoes on a high shelf, and located an onion in the root cellar beneath the kitchen floor. Not fancy by Boston standards, but after weeks of terrible food, she could make something substantial and satisfying. She was chopping the onion when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Through the window, she saw Jack riding in on a beautiful black horse, his hat tilted back from his forehead, his shirt dusty from the day's work. He dismounted with fluid grace and led the horse toward the barn, speaking to it the same way he'd spoken to the mare that morning, with respect and affection. Margaret found herself wondering what it would be like to be spoken to that way, to be treated with such consistent gentleness. She shook off the thought and returned to her cooking. She had no business entertaining such notions. Jack Carter had offered her sanctuary, nothing more. She was here temporarily, just until she could figure out her next move. Getting attached to this place, or worse, to him, would be foolish and dangerous. But when Jack came in 20 minutes later, having washed up at the pump outside, and stopped dead in the doorway of the kitchen, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of Margaret stirring a pot of beans fragrant with onions and tomatoes, something in her chest tightened despite her best intentions. "That smells like heaven," he said, his voice almost reverent. "It's just beans," Margaret said, fighting to keep her tone casual. "Nothing fancy." "It's not just beans. It's beans that smell like someone actually cared while making them." Jack leaned against the doorframe, and Margaret was acutely aware of how the evening light caught the strong lines of his face. I can't remember the last time this house smelled like this. Like a home. The word hung between them, weighted with meaning neither of them quite knew how to address. Margaret turned back to her pot, stirring unnecessarily just to have something to do with her hands. "There's cornbread in the oven," she said. "Should be ready in about 10 minutes. Can I do anything to help?" "Set the table, maybe, if you don't mind." They moved around the kitchen in a dance of careful politeness, Jack setting out plates and utensils while Margaret finished the meal. Clara, who'd been dozing in the rocking chair, woke up and immediately started fussing. Jack moved toward her without hesitation, scooping her up with surprising confidence. "Hey there, little miss," he murmured, settling her against his shoulder with the same gentleness he'd shown the skittish mare. "You telling us you're ready for supper too?" Margaret watched, transfixed, as Clara immediately quieted in his arms. The baby stared up at Jack's face with wide-eyed fascination, her little hand reaching up to grab at his collar. "She likes you," Margaret said softly. Jack smiled down at Clara, his whole expression transforming with warmth. "I always did get along better with females than males. Horses, cattle, babies, they all seem to trust me for some reason." He glanced up at Margaret, and something in his eyes made her breath catch. "Maybe because I try to be gentle with things that need gentleness." Margaret had to look away, her cheeks warming. "The cornbread's ready." They sat down to eat as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky outside in shades of orange and purple. Jack took his first bite of the beans and actually closed his eyes, a sound of pure satisfaction escaping him. "Margaret," he said seriously, "if I'd known you could cook like this, I would have offered you my ranch, not just a room." Despite herself, Margaret laughed. A real laugh, the first she'd managed in weeks. "It's truly just beans, Jack. These are not just beans, these are beans with dignity, beans with purpose." He took another bite, then grinned at her. "I'm not even joking. After 5 years of eating my own cooking, this is a revelation." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, Clara sitting in Margaret's lap and gnawing contentedly on a crust of cornbread. Bear lay at Jack's feet, occasionally receiving small scraps that Jack pretended he wasn't feeding him. "Can I ask you something?" Jack said finally, his tone careful. "You don't have to answer if you don't want to." Margaret tensed. "All right. What happened? I mean, I know Anderson disappeared, but what made you come west in the first place? You seem like a city woman, educated, refined. This is a hard land for someone not born to it." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, staring down at Clara's downy head. How much should she tell him? How much did he deserve to know? "My sister Emily and I were seamstresses in Boston," she said finally. "We shared a small apartment, made enough to get by. Then Emily met a man, a merchant who seemed respectable, charming. He courted her properly, made all the right promises. By the time she discovered he was already married with a family in New York, she was pregnant." Jack's expression darkened. "He abandoned her. Worse. He denied everything, claimed Emily had pursued him, that she was lying about the baby being his. His wife's family was wealthy and connected. They made sure Emily lost her job, made sure no one would hire her. Margaret's voice caught. "We tried to manage, but without work, without money, Emily was so stressed during the pregnancy. She developed complications. The midwife said it was eclampsia, that the stress had made her ill. She survived just long enough to hold Clara once before she died." "God, Margaret, I'm so sorry." "I was suddenly alone with a newborn baby, no income, and Boston society had thoroughly ostracized us. Emily's merchant had made sure everyone knew his version of the story. I tried to find work, but no one would hire a woman with an infant. I was running out of money, running out of options, when I saw an advertisement for mail-order brides in the West. Men looking for wives, promising homes and stability." She laughed bitterly. "I thought it was the answer, a fresh start where no one knew our story, where Clara could grow up without the stigma of her birth." "And you got Peter Anderson." "I got letters from a man who claimed to have a successful ranch, a good home, a desire for family. He sent money for passage. I sold everything I had left of value and came west." Margaret met Jack's eyes, her own burning with unshed tears. I should have known better. I should have realized that if something seems too good to be true, it usually is. Jack reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his palm. You did what you had to do to survive, to protect your niece. That's nothing to be ashamed of. I feel like such a fool. You're not a fool, you're brave. Jack's voice was firm, certain. You crossed half a continent alone with a baby, trying to build a better life. Most people wouldn't have that kind of courage. Margaret blinked rapidly, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. I don't feel brave. I feel terrified and lost and completely out of my depth. That's what brave means, though. Doing what needs to be done even when you're scared. Jack finally let his hand settle over hers, warm and solid and grounding. And you're not alone anymore. You've got a safe place here for as long as you need it. The simple kindness of it broke something inside Margaret. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them, and she turned her face away, embarrassed by the show of emotion. I'm sorry, she managed. I don't usually... Don't apologize. Jack squeezed her hand gently, then withdrew, giving her space. You've been carrying a terrible weight for a long time. You're allowed to set it down sometimes. They finished the meal in quieter tones, Jack carefully steering the conversation to lighter topics. Stories about Bear's puppyhood, the time he tried to bake bread and nearly burned down his barn, the peculiarities of Arizona weather. By the time they'd cleaned up the dishes together, working in easy tandem, Margaret felt steadier, more centered. I should get Clara ready for bed, she said, though the baby was already drowsing against her shoulder. Of course, I'll just... Jack gestured vaguely toward the door. I usually spend the evening on the porch. Good time to watch the sunset, think about the day. You're welcome to join me if you want, or not. Whatever suits you. Margaret got Clara settled in her makeshift crib, a wooden drawer from the dresser lined with soft blankets, and stood for a moment in the growing darkness of her room. Through the window, she could see Jack sitting on the porch steps, his guitar cradled in his lap, playing soft chords that drifted through the evening air like smoke. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, lonesome and sweet at the same time, full of yearning for something just out of reach. Margaret found herself drawn to it, pulled by the aching vulnerability in those notes. Before she could second-guess herself, she slipped out of her room and through the front door. Jack looked up as she approached, his fingers stilling on the strings. I hope I'm not intruding, Margaret said. Not at all. Jack shifted over on the step, making room for her. I learned to play from my pa. He said every cowboy worth his salt should know at least 3 songs, one for celebrating, one for mourning, and one for the long, lonely nights. Which one was that? Jack smiled faintly. The third kind. He strummed a few more chords, then began playing something different, lighter, more hopeful. This one's more for celebrating. Seems more appropriate tonight. Margaret sat beside him, careful to maintain a proper distance, and listened as Jack played. The sky above them deepened from purple to indigo, stars beginning to emerge in brilliant clusters. The air was finally cooling from the day's brutal heat, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called out to its pack. It's beautiful out here, Margaret said quietly. So different from Boston. You miss it? The city? Sometimes. I miss the theaters, the bookshops, the feeling of being surrounded by life and culture, but, she paused, searching for the right words. There's something about this that Boston never had. Space to breathe. Room for possibility. Jack's fingers moved across the strings in a gentle pattern. That's what I love about this land. It doesn't care who you were or what mistakes you made. Out here, you get to decide who you want to be. Is that what you did? Decided who you wanted to be? Still deciding, I think. Jack glanced at her, his eyes unreadable in the gathering darkness. But I know I want to be the kind of man my parents would be proud of. Someone who keeps his word, treats people fairly, takes care of what's been entrusted to him. I think you've succeeded. The words came out softer than Margaret intended, more intimate. Jack's hand stilled on the guitar, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other in the starlight. Margaret felt something shift between them. A recognition, maybe, or the first trembling awareness of possibility. Then Clara's cry shattered the moment, high and urgent from inside the house. Margaret jumped to her feet, the spell broken. I should... Of course, go ahead. Margaret hurried inside, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the baby's cries. Clara had simply lost her pacifier and wanted comfort, settling immediately once Margaret picked her up and rocked her gently. But Margaret stood there in the darkness of her room, Clara warm against her shoulder, and tried to calm the confused tangle of emotions churning inside her. She couldn't afford to feel anything for Jack Carter beyond gratitude. She couldn't let herself imagine that this temporary sanctuary might become something more. That path led only to heartbreak and disappointment. She'd learned that lesson too painfully with Emily's merchant, with Peter Anderson's lies. And yet, when she heard the soft strains of Jack's guitar resume outside, when she remembered the gentle weight of his hand over hers at dinner, when she thought about the way he'd looked at her in the starlight, Margaret couldn't quite silence the small, treacherous hope blooming in her chest. The next morning, Margaret woke to the sound of roosters crowing and the smell of coffee brewing. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The bed was too comfortable, the air too clean, the light through the window too golden. Then memory returned, and with it, a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty. Clara was already awake, cooing softly to herself and examining her own tiny hands with intense concentration. Margaret changed her, fed her, and ventured out into the main house to find Jack at the stove, attempting to fry eggs. "Morning," he said, glancing over his shoulder with a slightly sheepish expression. "I was trying to make breakfast, but I'm remembering why I usually stick to cold cornbread and coffee." Margaret surveyed the pan, where the eggs were simultaneously burned on the bottom and raw on top, an impressive feat of poor cooking. "Let me," she said, gently taking the spatula from his hand. "You sure? You already made supper last night." "I'm sure. Besides, I'm not certain I can watch you torture those eggs any longer." Jack laughed and stepped back, leaning against the counter to watch her work. "Fair enough. I'll stick to what I'm good at: cattle, horses, and fixing broken fences." Margaret salvaged what she could of the eggs and started fresh ones in a clean pan, adding a bit of butter she found in the cold box and some wild herbs she'd spotted growing near the creek yesterday. Within minutes, she had fluffy scrambled eggs and toasted bread ready, along with fresh coffee. They ate together on the porch, watching the sun climb higher and burn off the last of the morning coolness. Jack told her about his plans for the day, checking on a pregnant cow that was due soon, mending some fence line on the eastern boundary, maybe working with the young mare again. "I could use some help around the house if you're willing," Margaret said. "That is, if you don't mind me taking liberties with your home." "Take all the liberties you want," Jack said. "Truth is, I know I should keep things cleaner, more organized, but between the ranch work and just basic survival, housekeeping falls to the bottom of the list." "Then consider it my contribution, room and board in exchange for cooking and cleaning." Jack frowned. "That's not the arrangement, Margaret. You're not hired help." "I know, but I'd feel better if I was contributing something. I don't like feeling useless." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. If it makes you feel better, but only because you want to, not because you have to. The second it feels like an obligation, you stop. Deal?" "Deal." Jack headed out after breakfast, and Margaret spent the morning transforming the house. She started with the kitchen, scrubbing every surface until it gleamed, organizing the shelves in a way that actually made sense, discovering forgotten supplies in the back of cupboards. Then she moved to the main room, sweeping thoroughly, beating the dust from the curtains, rearranging the furniture slightly to catch the best light. Clara seemed content to lie on a blanket on the floor, watching dust motes and occasionally attempting to grab Bear's tail when the patient dog wandered close. The baby's presence made the work feel less like drudgery and more like creating a home, a real home, maybe for the first time in her life. By midday, Margaret was hot and dusty but satisfied. The house looked and felt different, cared for, lived in, loved. She made a simple lunch of bread and cheese that then took Clara out to sit under one of the cottonwood trees near the creek, letting the baby splash her tiny hands in the cool water while Margaret soaked her aching feet. She was dozing in the dappled shade when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Jack rode up on his black horse, then dismounted and led the animal to the creek to drink. "You've been busy," he observed, nodding toward the house. "I could see the difference from halfway across the property." windows practically sparkling. I may have gotten a bit carried away, Margaret admitted, but it needed doing. Jack settled onto the grass nearby, pulling off his hat and wiping his forehead with his sleeve. His hair was dark with sweat, his face sun-flushed, and there was something indefinably appealing about the picture he made. Honest work and masculine competence mixed with that underlying gentleness that set him apart. "The pregnant cow had her calf this morning," he said. "Little heifer, healthy and strong. Mother's doing fine, too." "That's wonderful. Want to see them?" "They're in the near pasture. Could carry the baby out there if you want." Margaret found herself nodding before she'd really thought about it. They walked together through the afternoon heat, Clara riding on Jack's shoulders and grabbing at his hat with delighted giggles. The new calf was indeed beautiful, all long legs and liquid eyes staying close to her mother's side. "First one of the season," Jack said, pride evident in his voice. "If the rest of the herd does this well, it'll be a good year." "How many cattle do you have?" "About 60 head right now, hoping to build up to 100 in the next few years. More than that, and I'd need to hire permanent help, which I'm not quite ready for." He glanced at her. "I like the quiet, the solitude. Though," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Having you and Clara here has made me realize maybe I've had too much solitude. Maybe it's good to have other voices in the house, other laughter." Margaret's heart did something complicated in her chest. "We won't be here forever, Jack. I need to figure out what comes next. Find work, make a plan." "I know." His voice was quiet, almost sad. "But while you are here, I'm grateful for it." They walked back to the house as the afternoon shadows lengthened, talking about small things, the weather, the ranch, Clara's rapidly developing personality. But underneath the casual conversation, Margaret felt the current of something deeper, something neither of them quite dared to name. That evening, after another dinner that made Jack praise her cooking to an embarrassing degree, they sat on the porch again. Jack played his guitar while Margaret hummed along, discovering that their voices blended together surprisingly well, his rough baritone and her clear soprano creating harmonies that seemed to belong to the desert twilight. "You have a beautiful voice," Jack said when the song ended. "Did you sing in Boston?" "In church, sometimes. Emily and I used to sing together while we worked. She had a lovely alto." Margaret's voice caught on her sister's name. She would have loved it here. The space, the peace. She always felt trapped in the city. "Tell me about her," Jack said gently. "If you want to." So Margaret did. She told him about Emily's laugh, her terrible habit of burning everything she tried to cook, her gift for making beautiful clothes from scraps of fabric. She talked about how Emily had been the brave one, the dreamer, the one who'd always believed things would work out somehow. And she talked about holding her sister's hand as she slipped away, promising to care for Clara no matter what it took. "She made me promise that Clara would never know shame for how she was born," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face in the darkness. "That I'd protect her, give her a good life, make sure she knew she was loved and wanted." Jack reached over and took her hand, his rough palm warm against hers. "You're keeping that promise. Look at her. She's happy, healthy, loved. Emily would be proud of you." "I hope so." Margaret squeezed his hand, grateful for the solid comfort of his presence. "Sometimes I'm so scared I'm going to fail her, that I'm not enough." "You're more than enough, Margaret. You're exactly what that baby needs." Jack's thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand, a gesture so intimate it made Margaret's breath catch. "And for what it's worth, I think Emily would be proud of how strong you've been, how you've fought for Clara even when everything fell apart." They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the desert and the soft, sleepy sounds of Clara through the open window. When Margaret finally went inside to bed, she lay awake for hours, her hands still tingling from Jack's touch, her heart full of dangerous, impossible hope. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt almost too comfortable, too right. Margaret would wake early and make breakfast while Jack did the morning chores. They'd eat together, talking easily about ranch business and Clara's latest developments. Then Jack would head out to work while Margaret cared for the house and the baby, transforming Jack's bachelor quarters into something that felt like a home. In the afternoons, when the heat became too oppressive for indoor work, Margaret would take Clara down to the creek, and often Jack would find reasons to work nearby, mending fence, checking on cattle, breaking the young mare in the shaded corral. They'd talk across the distance, their conversations ranging from profound to playful, building a connection that felt both friendship and something more. And in the evenings, there was music. Jack would play his guitar, and Margaret would sing, their voices intertwining like their lives had begun to intertwine. Sometimes they'd talk late into the night. Sometimes they'd simply sit in comfortable silence. But always there was that awareness, that electrical current of possibility humming between them. On the 5th day, Jack brought the young mare up to the house for Margaret to meet properly. The horse was beautiful, nervous but not vicious, more in need of patience than breaking. "Her name's Willow," Jack said, running his hand along the mare's neck. "I bought her off a rancher going bust. She'd been mistreated, not beaten exactly, but ignored, left to half starve. Made her skittish of people." Margaret approached slowly, one hand extended, and was startled when Willow nuzzled her palm, snuffling hopefully for treats. "She likes you," Jack said, pleasure evident in his voice. "Took me 3 days to get her to let me touch her, and here you are making friends in 30 seconds. "Maybe she recognizes a kindred spirit," Margaret said softly, stroking the mare's soft nose. "Someone else who's been let down and is trying to learn to trust again." Jack looked at her with such warmth, such understanding, that Margaret had to turn away before she did something foolish, like kiss him. That night, a storm rolled across the desert. The first Margaret had experienced in Arizona. Thunder cracked like gunfire, and lightning illuminated the landscape in brilliant, terrifying flashes. Clara woke screaming, more frightened than Margaret had ever heard her. Before Margaret could even fully process what was happening, Jack was there, tapping softly on her door. "Is she all right?" he called over the thunder. "Just scared," Margaret called back, bouncing Clara desperately but unable to calm her. "I think the noise, 'Can I come in?' might help if she sees a calm adult." Margaret hesitated only a moment before opening the door. Jack slipped inside, his hair damp from rain that must have blown onto the porch, and immediately moved to where Margaret stood with the shrieking baby. "Hey there, little Clara," he murmured, taking her gently from Margaret's arms. "It's just noise, sweetheart. Just the sky making a fuss. Nothing to be scared of." He began to hum, that same haunting melody Margaret had heard him play on the guitar, and slowly, miraculously, Clara's screams subsided to whimpers. Jack swayed gently, keeping up that low, soothing sound, and within minutes the baby's eyes were drooping. Margaret watched, transfixed, as this rough cowboy transformed into the gentlest of caregivers. When Clara finally went completely limp in sleep, Jack carefully laid her back in her crib and tucked the blanket around her with practiced care. "You're good with her," Margaret whispered as they tiptoed toward the door. "I helped with my sister's babies before she moved to Colorado," Jack said quietly. "Got comfortable with the whole business. Besides, Clara's easy to love." They stood in the doorway of Margaret's room, the storm raging outside, neither quite willing to break the moment. Lightning flashed, illuminating Jack's face, and Margaret saw something in his eyes that made her heart stutter, longing and tenderness and carefully restrained desire. "Margaret," he said softly, "I need to tell you something." Her breath caught. "Yes?" Another crack of thunder, closer this time. Jack ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling with how to proceed. "This thing, you being here, it's..." He paused, then started again. "When I offered you a place to stay, it was meant to be temporary. Help you get on your feet, nothing more. But these past days, having you here, watching you bring life back to this house, hearing Clara laugh and your voice singing," he met her eyes directly. "Margaret, this place feels like home for the first time since my parents died, and it's because of you." Margaret's heart was pounding so hard she could barely hear over it. "Jack, I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I know you came west looking for one thing and found something completely different. I know you've got your own plans to make, your own life to build. But I wanted you to know," he took a deep breath, "if you wanted to stay, not just for a few weeks, but permanently, there's a place for you here, for both of you. As my wife, if you'd have me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and risk. Margaret stared at him, her mind spinning. This was too fast, too sudden, too much like the mistake she'd made with Peter Anderson, trusting a man's promises, letting hope override caution. But looking into Jack Carter's honest face, remembering the gentle way he'd held Clara, the respect he'd shown Margaret from the very first moment, the patience and kindness he'd demonstrated every single day, this wasn't Peter Anderson. This wasn't promises written in letters that could be lies. This was real and true and standing right in front of her. "I'm sorry," Jack said, misreading her silence. "That was too much, too soon. Please forget I said anything. You can stay as long as you need, no expectations, no pressure. I shouldn't have—" "Jack," Margaret reached out and placed her hand on his chest, feeling his heart thundering beneath her palm. "I'm not saying no. I need time to think, to be sure. This is everything I hoped for when I came west, but I'm frightened of making another mistake, of trusting the wrong person again." Understanding softened Jack's features. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere, and neither is the offer. Whenever you're ready, a week from now, a month, a year, I'll be here waiting." Lightning flashed again, illuminating the vulnerability in his eyes, and Margaret made a decision. She rose up on her toes and pressed a soft, brief kiss to his cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, "for being patient, for being honest, for being you." Jack's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with infinite tenderness. "Thank you for bringing my heart back to life," he murmured. "I didn't even realize how numb I'd become until you arrived and reminded me what living actually feels like." Then he stepped back, giving her space, giving her time. "Good night, Margaret. Try to get some rest." After he left, Margaret stood in her doorway for a long time, listening to the storm rage outside and the quieter storm of emotions raging in her heart. Jack Carter wanted to marry her, wanted to give her and Clara a permanent home, a real family, a future built on honesty and respect. It was everything she'd dreamed of, everything she'd hoped to find when she stepped off that stagecoach in Copper Creek. And for the first time since Emily died, Margaret allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the happy ending she'd stopped believing in might actually be within reach. Margaret woke the next morning to find the world washed clean by the storm. The air smelled of wet earth and sage, and through her window she could see droplets of water still clinging to the cottonwood leaves, catching the early sunlight like diamonds. Clara was awake but quiet, making those soft cooing sounds that meant she was content. And for a moment Margaret simply lay there, letting herself feel the profound peace of the morning. Then she remembered Jack's proposal, and her heart began to race all over again. She found him in the kitchen, already dressed for the day's work, pouring coffee with movements that seemed slightly more careful than usual, as though he too was feeling the weight of last night's conversation. When he looked up and saw her, something flickered in his eyes. Hope mixed with uncertainty. "Morning," he said quietly. "I made coffee. The eggs are probably beyond my ability this early, but the coffee's decent." "Morning." Margaret moved to the stove, needing something to do with her hands. "I'll make breakfast." They worked in silence that felt different from the comfortable quiet of previous mornings. This silence was charged, electric, full of things neither of them knew quite how to say. Margaret scrambled eggs and toasted bread while Jack sat at the table with Clara on his knee, letting the baby grab at his fingers with her surprisingly strong grip. "I've been thinking," Margaret said finally, setting plates on the table and sitting down across from him, "about what you said last night." Jack's whole body tensed, hope and fear warring across his features. And I think I need to understand what you're really offering, what marriage would mean to you, to us." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "Jack, I won't be a woman who's married out of pity or charity. I won't be someone's obligation." "You could never be that," Jack said immediately, fiercely. "Margaret, when I look at you, I don't see someone who needs rescuing. I see a woman who's already saved herself, who crossed a continent alone to protect her sister's child, who's turned a lonely house into a home in less than a week. I see strength and grace and beauty that takes my breath away." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You barely know me." "I know enough. I know you sing while you cook and that you bite your bottom lip when you're concentrating. I know you love that baby more than your own life, and that you've got more courage in your little finger than most men have in their whole body. I know that when you smile, it feels like sunrise after a long night." He paused, his voice dropping lower. "And I know that my heart decided it wanted you about 5 minutes after you stepped off that stagecoach looking lost and fierce at the same time." The raw honesty of it left Margaret breathless. "What if I disappoint you? What if I'm not who you think I am?" "Then we figure it out together." Jack reached across the table, palm up, an invitation rather than a demand. "Margaret, I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to build a life with me. The messy, complicated, beautiful reality of it. The good days and the hard ones. The laughter and the arguments and everything in between." Margaret stared at his outstretched hand, feeling the full weight of the decision before her. This was trust. This was risk. This was choosing to believe that maybe, finally, someone's promises could be real. She placed her hand in his, feeling his fingers close warm and sure around hers. "I'm still frightened," she admitted. "So am I," Jack said with a crooked smile. "I'm terrified I'll mess this up, say the wrong thing, not be good enough for you. But I figure being scared together is better than being brave alone." Despite the gravity of the moment, Margaret found herself smiling. "That's possibly the most sensible thing anyone's ever said to me. Does that mean it means I need a little more time? Not long, just enough to be certain." She squeezed his hand. "You've given me so much already, Jack. A home, safety, kindness when I desperately needed it. I want to be sure that what I'm feeling is real, and not just gratitude mixed with desperation." Something in Jack's expression eased. "That's fair. That's more than fair. Take whatever time you need." They finished breakfast in a more comfortable silence, the tension broken by Margaret's honesty. Afterward, Jack headed out to check on the new calf and work on the fence line that had been damaged in the storm, while Margaret settled into her morning routine with Clara. But as she went about her tasks, washing dishes, tidying rooms, preparing beans to soak for supper, Margaret found her mind returning again and again to Jack's words. Not just the proposal itself, but the way he'd framed it. A partnership. A life built together through good and bad. Not a rescue, but a choice. She thought about Peter Anderson's letters, full of pretty promises and empty charm. Then she thought about Jack's actions over the past week. The consistent respect, the gentle patience, the way he'd never once made her feel obligated or pressured. Words were easy to write, but Jack had shown her who he was through deed after deed after deed. Around mid-morning, Margaret carried Clara outside to get some fresh air. The storm had left puddles scattered across the yard, and the baby was fascinated by the way sunlight danced on the water's surface. They were sitting in the shade of the porch when Margaret heard the sound of a wagon approaching. A woman was driving, middle-aged, sturdy, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. She pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down with the easy competence of someone long accustomed to ranch life. "You must be Margaret," the woman called out, her voice warm. "I'm Helen Morrison. My husband and I ranch about 8 miles east of here. Jack mentioned you were staying with him when he came by yesterday to return some tools." Margaret stood, unconsciously smoothing her skirts, suddenly hyper-aware of what this visit might mean. News traveled fast in isolated communities. If the neighbors knew she was living at Jack's ranch, unchaperoned, the assumptions and gossip would be spreading like wildfire. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Morrison." "Oh, call me Helen. We don't stand on formality out here." The woman's eyes landed on Clara, and her expression softened. "And who's this precious girl?" "This is Clara, my niece. She's beautiful." "How old?" 6 months. Helen climbed onto the porch, moving with the ease of someone who felt no need to wait for an invitation. "I won't stay long, got bread rising at home that needs tending, but I wanted to come by and welcome you proper. Also wanted to say," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "Jack Carter's one of the finest men in this territory. Lost his folks young, but he's made something of himself through honest work and decent character. If he's vouched for you, that's all the reference you need around these parts." Margaret felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "That's very kind of you to say. It's just the truth. Though I'll admit, folks in Copper Creek are bound to talk. Young woman staying at a bachelor's ranch, people will draw their own conclusions, fair or not. Helen's gaze was direct, but not unkind. I don't mean to pry into your business, but if you need anything, advice, help, or just another woman to talk to, you come find me. Lord knows this country's hard enough without us women supporting each other. Thank you, Margaret said, genuinely touched. That means more than you know. Helen stayed for another 20 minutes, talking about ranch life and offering tips on everything from dealing with scorpions to making butter in the desert heat. By the time she left, Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. She had an ally, a potential friend, a connection to the wider community that made this vast, empty land feel slightly less isolating. When Jack came in for lunch, Margaret told him about Helen's visit. The Morrisons are good people, Jack said, washing his hands at the pump. Helen's been ranch managing since before I was born. Knows more about cattle than most men will ever learn. Her husband Thomas is quiet but solid. They've got 3 grown sons working ranches of their own now. She was very kind. Told me I could come to her if I needed anything. Jack dried his hands, his expression thoughtful. Did she say anything else about the situation? Margaret understood what he was really asking. She mentioned that people would talk about me being here. They will, Jack said quietly. Small communities are like that. Everyone knows everyone's business. He turned to face her fully. If it becomes a problem, if the gossip makes things difficult for you, we could make other arrangements. I could ask Helen if you could stay with them for a while, or no. The word came out more forcefully than Margaret intended. I don't want to leave. Something blazed to life in Jack's eyes. You don't? No, this is... She gestured around the kitchen, struggling to articulate what she felt. This is the first place that's felt like home since Emily died. Maybe the first place that's ever felt like home, really. I don't want to give that up because of gossip. Jack crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, stopping just short of touching her. Margaret, if you're worried about your reputation, I'm worried about my happiness, she interrupted. For once in my life, I'm choosing what I want instead of what's proper or expected or safe. She took a deep breath, feeling the truth of her words settle in her bones. And what I want is to stay here. With you. The smile that spread across Jack's face was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Are you saying I'm saying yes. To staying, to marriage, to building a life together. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears this time. I'm saying that I trust you, Jack Carter, and I'm ready to take that risk. For a heartbeat, Jack simply stared at her as though he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Then he cupped her face in both hands, his touch reverent, and leaned down slowly enough that she could have pulled away if she wanted to. She didn't want to. Their kiss was gentle, tentative, sweet as first kisses should be. Jack's lips were soft against hers, his hands trembling slightly where they framed her face, and Margaret felt something deep inside her chest unlock and unfold like a flower reaching for the sun. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Jack rested his forehead against hers. Say it again, he whispered. Please, so I know I didn't imagine it. Yes, Margaret said, laughing through her tears. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes to all of it. Jack pulled her close, wrapping her in arms that felt like safety and home, and everything she'd been searching for without quite knowing it. Clara, lying on her blanket nearby, let out a squeal of delight as though she understood the significance of the moment, and they both laughed. We should do it soon, Jack said, his voice slightly muffled against Margaret's hair. The marriage, I mean, not because I'm worried about gossip, but because... He pulled back to look at her. Because I don't want to spend another day not calling you my wife. Margaret felt warmth flood through her. How soon? This Sunday? We could ride into Riverton. It's bigger than Copper Creek, has a proper church, and a reverend. Helen and Thomas could stand as witnesses if they're willing. This Sunday, Margaret repeated, testing the words. 4 days away. 4 days until her entire life changed forever. It should have terrified her. Instead, she felt only a deep, settling certainty. Yes, let's not wait. The rest of that day passed in a blur of planning and preparation. Jack rode over to the Morrison Ranch to ask Helen and Thomas to serve as witnesses, returning with Helen's enthusiastic agreement and an offer to provide the wedding supper at their ranch afterward. Margaret went through her meager wardrobe, trying to decide what to wear, wishing desperately that she had something more appropriate than her worn traveling dress or her two faded day dresses. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jack pulled a small wooden box from his pocket. "I want to give you something," he said, his voice nervous. "It's not much, but—" He opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring with a small pearl set in the center. The band was slightly worn, the pearl modest but luminous in the fading light. "It was my mother's," Jack said quietly. "My father gave it to her when they married. She wore it every day until she died." He looked at Margaret, vulnerability written across his face. "I know it's not fancy. I know it's not what a Boston woman might expect. But it would mean everything to me if you'd wear it." Margaret's vision blurred with tears as she looked at the ring, this precious link to Jack's past, to the parents he'd loved and lost. "It's beautiful. Jack, are you sure? This is your mother's ring. It's meant for my wife," Jack interrupted gently. "And you're going to be my wife. I can't think of anyone I'd rather see wearing it." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as though it had been waiting all along for her to claim it. Margaret held her hand up to the light, watching the pearl glow soft and warm. "My mother believed pearls meant unexpected blessings," Jack said softly. "Things you never thought to hope for, but that change your life when they arrive." He laced his fingers through hers. "That's what you are to me, Margaret, an unexpected blessing." Margaret leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder, and let herself feel the full weight of happiness. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. There would be gossip to weather, adjustments to make, the everyday work of building a life together. But tonight, wearing his mother's ring and wrapped in his arms, Margaret allowed herself to simply be happy. The next 3 days passed in a flurry of activity. Helen Morrison arrived the following morning with a beautiful dress, pale blue calico with delicate white flowers embroidered at the collar and cuffs. "It was mine when I married Thomas," Helen said, holding it up for Margaret to see. "I've kept it all these years, and it's just been sitting in a trunk taking up space. I'd be honored if you'd wear it." The dress fit Margaret almost perfectly. Just a few minor adjustments needed at the waist and hem. Standing in front of the small mirror in her room, wearing Helen's wedding dress with Jack's mother's ring on her finger, Margaret barely recognized herself. She looked like a woman about to marry for love, not desperation. She looked happy. Jack spent those days working twice as hard as usual, determined to get the ranch in order before the wedding. He mended every fence that needed fixing, checked every head of cattle, cleaned out the barn until it gleamed. Margaret caught him whistling while he worked, a sound that made her heart swell with affection. On Saturday evening, the night before the wedding, they sat on the porch as had become their custom. But tonight felt different, weighted with anticipation and the knowledge that tomorrow everything would change. "Are you nervous?" Margaret asked, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. "Terrified," Jack admitted with a rueful smile. "Not about marrying you. That's the only thing I'm certain about. But I keep worrying I'll mess up the vows or trip on my way to the altar or forget how to speak English entirely." Margaret laughed. "I don't think the Reverend will hold it against you if you stumble over a word or two. What about you? Having any second thoughts?" She considered the question seriously. Was she nervous? Yes. Was she uncertain? Perhaps a little. But beneath all of that was a solid foundation of rightness, of knowing in her bones that this decision was true. "No second thoughts," she said finally. "But I'm nervous about what comes after. The reality of being married, of learning how to live with someone, of—" She trailed off, blushing. Jack reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "We'll figure it out as we go. Together. And Margaret?" He waited until she met his eyes. "I want you to know that I'll never push you. Never expect more than you're ready to give. We can take things as slow as you need." The gentleness of it, the respect implicit in his words, made Margaret's decision feel even more right. She squeezed his hand. "Thank you for being patient with me." "Thank you for choosing me," Jack said simply. That night, Margaret lay awake long after Clara had fallen asleep, her mind too full of thoughts and feelings to quiet. Tomorrow she would become Jack Carter's wife. Tomorrow she would pledge her life to a man she'd known for barely 2 weeks. It was reckless and impulsive and completely insane by any reasonable measure. And yet, lying there in the darkness with Jack's mother's ring warm on her finger and the sound of the desert wind singing through the cottonwoods, Margaret had never felt more certain of anything in her life. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, the sky an endless expanse of blue unmarred by a single cloud. Margaret woke early, her stomach fluttering with nerves and excitement in equal measure. Helen had arranged for a neighbor girl to watch Clara during the ceremony, so Margaret spent the morning getting herself ready, washing her hair in the creek and letting it dry in the sun until it shone. When she finally put on Helen's wedding dress, she felt transformed. The blue fabric brought out the color of her eyes, and the embroidered flowers made her feel feminine and beautiful in a way she hadn't felt since before Emily died. She pulled her hair back in a simple but elegant style, letting a few curls frame her face, and allowed herself a moment of pure vanity in front of the mirror. Jack knocked on her door mid-morning, his voice slightly strained. "Margaret, I'm heading to the Morrisons to help Thomas with some last-minute preparations. Helen will be here in about an hour to bring you and Clara to Riverton. I'll see you at the church." "Jack?" Margaret called before he could leave. "Yeah?" She opened the door just wide enough to see him, careful to keep him from seeing her in the wedding dress. Some traditions were worth keeping. Jack stood in the hallway wearing his best clothes, clean trousers, a pressed white shirt, a dark vest that made his shoulders look impossibly broad. His hair was neatly combed back, and he'd shaved carefully, though she could see a small nick on his jaw where the razor had slipped. He looked devastatingly handsome. He looked like a man about to get married. "I just wanted to say," Margaret said softly, "that I'm glad it's you." Jack's whole face softened with emotion. "I'm glad it's you too, Margaret. More glad than I've got words to say." After he left, Margaret finished her preparations and got Clara dressed in a sweet little white gown that Helen had brought along with the wedding dress. The baby seemed to sense something special was happening and was on her best behavior, cooing and smiling at everything around her. Helen arrived precisely on time, driving a well-sprung buggy that would make the ride to Riverton more comfortable than Jack's work wagon. As they rode, Helen kept up a steady stream of cheerful conversation that helped ease Margaret's nerves. Riverton was larger than Copper Creek, a real town with multiple streets, shops, a bank, and a beautiful white church with a steeple that could be seen from a mile away. Helen drove straight to the church, where a small group had already gathered. Thomas Morrison and his weathered face creased with a welcoming smile, Jack standing on the church steps looking nervous and hopeful and heart-stoppingly handsome, and Reverend Thompson, an older man with kind eyes and a gentle manner. Jack's expression when he saw Margaret step down from the buggy was something she knew she'd remember for the rest of her life. His eyes went wide, his mouth fell slightly open, and for a long moment he simply stared at her as though seeing something miraculous. "Margaret," he breathed when she reached him, You look beautiful," Helen finished for him when Jack seemed incapable of completing the sentence. "Our girl looks beautiful, Jack, though you're not looking too shabby yourself." Reverend Thompson ushered them inside the church, which was simple but lovely, with afternoon light streaming through the windows and wild flowers arranged in mason jars on the altar. Helen took Clara and settled into a pew with Thomas, giving Margaret and Jack a moment alone before the ceremony began. "Are you ready for this?" Jack asked quietly, taking both her hands in his. "More ready than I've ever been for anything," Margaret answered honestly. The ceremony itself was short but meaningful. Reverend Thompson spoke about marriage as a partnership built on mutual respect, love, and the willingness to weather life's storms together. When it came time for the vows, Jack's voice was strong and clear, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "I, Jack Henry Carter, take you, Margaret Ann Ellis, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to honor you, respect you, protect you, and love you for all the days of my life. In good times and in hard times, in sickness and in health, I will stand beside you. This is my solemn vow." Margaret's own voice trembled slightly as she spoke her vows, but the words came from her heart. "I, Margaret Ann Ellis, take you, Jack Henry Carter, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to honor you, respect you, support you, and love you for all the days of my life. In good times and in hard times, in sickness and in health, I will stand beside you. This is my solemn vow." When Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife, when Jack leaned down to kiss her with such tenderness it brought tears to her eyes, Margaret felt something fundamental shift inside her. She was no longer alone, no longer adrift. She was Margaret Carter now, with a home and a husband and a future stretching out before her like the endless Arizona sky. Helen and Thomas hosted them for a wedding supper at their ranch, a feast of roasted chicken, fresh vegetables, biscuits with honey, and an apple pie that Helen declared was her specialty. They ate and talked and laughed, Clara being passed around and cooed over by everyone. And for the first time in longer than Margaret could remember, she felt part of something larger than herself, part of a community, a family. As the sun began to set, Jack and Margaret said their goodbyes and headed home in the wagon, Clara sleeping peacefully between them. The ride was quiet, both of them perhaps feeling the weight of what they'd done, the commitment they'd made. "Mrs. Carter," Jack said finally, testing out her new name. "Mr. Carter," Margaret replied, smiling. "I like the sound of that." "So do I." When they reached the ranch, Jack helped Margaret down from the wagon with exaggerated care, as though she were made of something precious and fragile. She carried Clara inside while Jack tended to the horses, and by the time he came in, she'd gotten the baby settled in her crib and was standing in the main room, suddenly uncertain. They were married now. This was their wedding night. What came next? Jack seemed to sense her nervousness. He approached slowly, giving her time to adjust, and took her hands gently in his. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I meant what I said before. We don't have to rush anything. This has been a big day, and—" She kissed him, cutting off his careful words with the press of her lips against his. She'd spent too long being cautious, too long letting fear dictate her choices. Jack had given her nothing but gentleness and respect and unwavering kindness. She trusted him. She wanted this. "I'm not scared," she whispered against his mouth. "Not of this. Not of you." Jack's arms came around her, pulling her close, and when he kissed her back, it was with a passion barely leashed, a hunger kept carefully in check until she'd given clear permission. Margaret melted into him, into the warmth and strength of his embrace, and let herself feel the full force of the desire that had been building between them for days. "I love you," Jack murmured against her hair, her throat, her lips. "God, Margaret, I love you so much." "I love you too," she breathed, and realized with a shock of joy that it was true. Somewhere between the stagecoach station and this moment, between his first offer of help and this wedding night, she'd fallen completely, irrevocably in love with Jack Carter. He swept her into his arms and carried her to his room, their room now, kicking the door closed behind them. And as the desert stars wheeled overhead and the night wrapped around the ranch like a blessing, Margaret gave herself over to her husband's gentle hands and gentler heart, finally home. Later, much later, they lay tangled together in the darkness, Margaret's head on Jack's chest, his fingers trailing lazy patterns along her bare shoulder. Through the open window, they could hear the night sounds of the desert, crickets singing, a coyote's distant call, the soft rustle of wind through sage. "What are you thinking?" Jack asked quietly. Margaret considered the question. What was she thinking? That she'd come west expecting one thing and found something entirely different, entirely better. That the mail-order husband who'd abandoned her had inadvertently led her to the real love she'd never thought to find. That sometimes the worst disasters open doors to the greatest blessings. "I'm thinking," she said finally, "that I'm grateful Peter Anderson was a liar and a coward. Because if he'd been waiting at that stagecoach station like he promised, I never would have met you." Jack's arms tightened around her. "That's a generous way to look at it. It's the truth. Everything that went wrong, Emily's death, the terrible journey west, Anderson's betrayal, all of it led me here. To you. To this." She propped herself up on one elbow to look at him in the moonlight streaming through the window. "I don't regret a single step of the journey now that I know where it was leading. Jack reached up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. I love you, Margaret Carter. I loved you when you stepped off that stagecoach looking fierce and lost. I loved you when you looked at me like I might be a threat or a savior, and you couldn't decide which. I loved you when you first sang with me on the porch. And I'll love you every day for the rest of our lives. Promise? Margaret whispered, her voice catching. I promise. With everything I am. She kissed him again, soft and sweet, a sealing of the vow. Outside, the desert night sang its ancient song. And inside, two souls who'd been lost found their way home in each other's arms. Margaret had traveled thousands of miles searching for security and found something far more precious instead, a love built on honesty, respect, and the courage to trust again. As she drifted towards sleep, wrapped in her husband's embrace, Margaret sent up a silent prayer of thanks for the journey, for the heartbreak that had led her here, for the cowboy who'd said, I'll lead you home, and kept his promise in ways she never could have imagined. She was home. Finally, truly, completely home. The first light of morning found Margaret still wrapped in Jack's arms, their bodies curved together like two halves of the same whole. She woke slowly, luxuriously, aware of warmth and safety, and a bone-deep contentment she'd never experienced before. Jack's breath stirred her hair, steady and even, and she allowed herself a moment of pure indulgence, just lying there feeling the solid reality of him against her back, his arm draped protectively across her waist. She was married. She was Margaret Carter now, and this beautiful, gentle man was her husband. The thought still seemed almost too miraculous to be real. Jack stirred behind her, pressing a sleepy kiss to her bare shoulder. Morning, Mrs. Carter, he murmured, his voice rough with sleep and infinitely tender. Morning, Mr. Carter. Margaret turned in his arms to face him, taking in the sight of his tousled hair and the soft expression in his dark eyes. How did you sleep? Like I'd finally found what I'd been searching for my whole life without knowing I was searching. Jack's fingers traced the line of her jaw with reverent gentleness. How about you? Better than I have in years, maybe ever. They lay there for a long moment, simply looking at each other, the morning light gradually strengthening through the window. Then Clara's cry shattered the peaceful silence, sharp and demanding, and they both laughed. Duty calls, Margaret said, starting to sit up, but Jack caught her hand. Let me get her. You stay here and rest. He pulled on his trousers and padded out barefoot, returning moments later with Clara in his arms. The baby was red-faced and fussing, her tiny fists waving indignantly, but she quieted the moment she saw Margaret. Someone's hungry, Jack observed, settling on the edge of the bed and passing Clara to Margaret with easy familiarity. I'll go make coffee and start on breakfast. Take your time. After he left, Margaret fed Clara and changed her, marveling at how different this morning felt from all the mornings before. The same tasks, the same baby, but everything transformed by the knowledge that she wasn't alone anymore. That Jack was in the kitchen making terrible coffee and probably burning whatever he was attempting to cook, and that this was her life now, their life together. She dressed quickly and carried Clara to the kitchen, where she found Jack staring at a pan of eggs with an expression of profound confusion. I don't understand, he said, gesturing at the pan. I followed your instructions exactly. Low heat, keep them moving. Don't walk away. But they're still either raw in the middle or rubber on the outside. Margaret peered into the pan and bit back a smile. Darling, your definition of low heat might need some adjustment. This pan is practically glowing. Oh. Jack looked genuinely perplexed. No wonder. I thought low heat meant just less high. Let me show you. Margaret set Clara in the basket Jack had fashioned for her, then stepped up beside him at the stove. She adjusted the damper to lower the heat properly, then guided his hand holding the spatula, showing him the gentle folding motion that kept eggs creamy rather than tough. Like this. Slow and patient, just like breaking a horse. Jack's free arm came around her waist, pulling her back against him. I like this, he said softly. Teaching each other things. Building something together. So do I. Margaret turned her head to kiss his jaw. Though I have to admit your cooking is so terrible that you've given me plenty of room to shine. Happy to be your foil, Jack said with a grin. "You make the food edible, and I'll make sure we have food to make edible." They finished breakfast together, moving around the kitchen in an easy dance that was already becoming familiar. Afterward, Jack headed out to tend to the morning chores while Margaret tidied up and got Clara settled for her morning nap. The house felt different now, not just Jack's ranch where she was staying, but truly home. Her home. Their home. She was humming as she washed dishes when she heard horses approaching. Through the window, she saw 3 riders coming up the path, not Helen and Thomas this time, but strangers. Margaret's stomach clenched with sudden anxiety. She dried her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch just as Jack emerged from the barn, moving to intercept the visitors. The lead rider was a well-dressed man in his 50s, sitting his horse with the easy confidence of wealth and authority. The 2 men flanking him looked like hired hands, hard-eyed and watchful. "Help you, gentlemen?" Jack called out, his tone polite but guarded. "You Jack Carter?" the lead man asked. "That's right. Name's Robert Lawson. I own the Double L Ranch about 40 miles south of here. I'm looking to buy some land in this area, and word is you might be willing to sell." Jack's whole body went rigid. "Word is wrong. This ranch isn't for sale." Lawson dismounted with deliberate slowness, looking around at the property with the assessing gaze of a man used to evaluating assets. "Now don't be hasty. I'm prepared to make a generous offer, more than this land is worth, frankly. You're what, 25? Young man like you could take that money, start fresh somewhere with better water, better grazing." "I said it's not for sale." Jack's voice had gone hard, flat. "This is my family's land. My parents built this ranch from nothing. I'm not selling." "Everyone's got a price, son. I'm offering you $5,000. That's more money than you'll see in 10 years of ranching. Think about what you could do with that." Margaret saw Jack's hands clench into fists at his sides. She moved down from the porch, coming to stand beside her husband, a silent show of support and unity. Lawson's eyes flicked to her, and something unpleasant crossed his face. "This, your wife?" "She is," Jack said, his arm coming around Margaret's waist. "Margaret, this is Robert Lawson. He was just leaving." "I don't think you understand the situation," Lawson said, his tone hardening. "I'm not asking as a favor. I need this land for my operation, and I'm going to get it one way or another. You can take my generous offer and walk away happy, or you can make this difficult, but the end result will be the same." "Are you threatening me?" Jack's voice was dangerously quiet. "I'm explaining reality." Lawson remounted his horse with fluid grace. "You've got until the end of the week to think about my offer. After that," he shrugged, "well, accidents happen on ranches. Fences get cut. Cattle wander off. Houses catch fire. It'd be a shame if something happened to that pretty wife of yours while you were out working the range." The threat was unmistakable. Margaret felt ice slide down her spine, but she forced herself to stand tall, refusing to show fear. Jack took a step forward, his whole body radiating barely controlled fury. "You get off my land, now! And if you ever threaten my wife again, I don't care how much money you have or how many men you've got. I will make you regret it." Lawson smiled, cold and contemptuous. "Big words from a small rancher. Think about my offer, Carter, and think about whether your pride is worth risking everything you love." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, his 2 men following. Margaret and Jack stood watching until the riders disappeared over the rise. Then Jack turned to her, his face pale beneath his tan. "I'm sorry," he said hoarsely. "God, Margaret, I'm so sorry. I never thought, I didn't know. It's not your fault." Margaret took his hand, squeezing hard. "Jack, who is he? Why does he want your land so badly?" "Robert Lawson's one of the biggest ranchers in the territory. He's been buying up smaller spreads for years, consolidating them into one massive operation. But he's not just ambitious, he's ruthless. I've heard stories about other ranchers who refuse to sell. Mysterious accidents, cattle poisoned, barns burned, and the law can't touch him because he's got money and connections." Margaret's mind was racing. "What are we going to do?" "I don't know." Jack ran a hand through his hair, frustration and fear warring in his expression. "I can't sell this land, Margaret. It's all I have of my parents, all I've worked for. But I can't risk you either. If something happened to you or Clara because of my stubbornness, stop." Margaret cupped his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. "We're not giving in to threats." This is our home. We'll figure out how to protect it. How? I'm one man against Lawson's whole operation. You're not one man. You're part of a community. Helen and Thomas, the other ranchers, they've all been threatened by Lawson at some point, haven't they? Jack nodded slowly. The Morrisons held out. So did the Jameson family to the north, but the Hendersons sold after their son got beaten so badly he nearly died. And the Wilsons lost everything when their barn burned with half their herd inside. Then we need to talk to the ones who stayed. We need to stand together. Margaret's voice was firm with conviction. Lawson's counting on everyone being too afraid to fight back. But if we all refuse to sell, if we watch out for each other, he can't intimidate us all. Something in Jack's expression shifted, fear giving way to determination. You're right. We'll ride over to the Morrisons tomorrow. Talk to them. Maybe organize a meeting with the other holdouts. He pulled Margaret close, burying his face in her hair. I meant what I said in my vows. I'll protect you with my life. I know. And I'll stand beside you through whatever comes. Margaret held him tight, feeling the rapid beat of his heart against hers. We're stronger together than either of us is alone. That's what marriage means. That afternoon, Jack taught Margaret how to shoot. He pulled out an old rifle that had belonged to his father and set up targets behind the barn, empty tin cans balanced on fence posts. I don't like the idea of you needing to defend yourself, Jack said, as he showed her how to load and aim. But after Lawson's threat, I need to know you can protect yourself and Clara if something happens when I'm out working. The rifle was heavier than Margaret expected, and the recoil jarred her shoulder painfully the first few times she fired. But she was a quick learner, and by the 10th shot she'd managed to hit one of the cans, sending it flying off the post with a satisfying ping. That's my girl, Jack said with fierce pride. Keep practicing. I want you to be able to hit a target at 50 yards without thinking about it. They spent 2 hours on shooting lessons, then moved on to other practical matters. Jack showed her where he kept the cash reserves, not much, but enough for emergencies, and explained the layout of the property, pointing out good hiding spots and escape routes if she ever needed them. The lessons were sobering, stripping away the romantic haze of newlywed bliss and replacing it with the harsh reality of their situation. But through it all, Margaret felt her resolve strengthening. She'd survived her sister's death, crossed a continent alone, rebuilt her life from nothing. She wasn't going to let some bully with money and hired thugs destroy what she and Jack were building together. That evening, they rode over to the Morrison ranch. Helen answered the door, took one look at their faces, and immediately ushered them inside. What's happened? She asked, as Thomas came in from the back room, concern written across his weathered features. Jack explained about Lawson's visit, not softening the threats or hiding his worry. Helen's face grew progressively more grim as he spoke. That son of a... Thomas muttered, then caught himself. Pardon my language, ladies, but Robert Lawson's been a plague on this territory for too long. He tried the same tactics on us 3 years back. What did you do? Margaret asked. We stood firm and made sure we were never alone or vulnerable, Helen said. Thomas made sure I knew how to shoot, and we had neighbors checking on us regular. After a few months with no success, Lawson moved on to easier targets, but we knew he'd be back eventually. He doesn't give up. He just bides his time. We need to organize, Jack said. All of us who've refused to sell. Watch each other's properties. Make sure no one's isolated. Strength in numbers. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. The Jamesons, the Fletchers, the Coopers, they're all in the same position. I can ride around tomorrow, arrange a meeting, but Jack, he paused, his expression grave. You need to be prepared for this to get worse before it gets better. Lawson's got resources we don't have. Money, men, connections with the law. I know. Jack's jaw was set with determination. But I'm not giving up my home without a fight. They talked strategy for another hour, planning watch rotations and emergency signals, discussing ways to document any threats or attacks in case they needed evidence for federal authorities. By the time Jack and Margaret headed home in the gathering dusk, they had the skeleton of a plan and the promise of community support. You holding up all right? Jack asked as they rode, Clara sleeping in Margaret's arms. I'm frightened, Margaret admitted, but I'm also angry. We've only just begun our life together and already someone's trying to destroy it. I won't let him, Jack. I won't. Jack reached over and squeezed her hand. That's my fierce Boston bride. I knew you had steel in you from the first moment I saw you. Over the following days, the community rallied. Thomas organized a meeting at his ranch, and 9 families showed up, all of them refusing to sell to Lawson, all of them aware of the danger, but determined to stand their ground. They worked out a system of rotating patrols, with someone always keeping watch over the most vulnerable properties. The men taught their wives and older children to shoot. They established emergency signals. Gunshots in rapid succession meant trouble, and everyone within earshot would ride to help. Margaret threw herself into preparations with fierce determination. She practiced shooting every afternoon until she could hit a target reliably at 75 yards. She helped Jack reinforce the barn doors and install better locks. She memorized every inch of their property, every hiding place, every escape route. And through it all, she cared for Clara and maintained their home, refusing to let fear consume their daily life. But the waiting was almost worse than action would have been. Every day that passed without incident felt like the calm before a storm. Jack slept restlessly, waking at every sound, his rifle always within reach. Margaret found herself jumping at shadows, her heart racing every time she heard horses approaching until she confirmed they were neighbors making their patrol rounds. 2 weeks after Lawson's visit, the first attack came. Margaret was in the garden mid-morning, Clara playing on a blanket in the shade, when she heard the distant sound of cattle bellowing in distress. Her head snapped up, instinct screaming that something was wrong. She scooped up Clara and ran toward the house just as Jack came racing back from the far pasture on his black horse, his face grim. "Someone cut the fence on the eastern boundary," he shouted. "Cattle are scattering into the canyon. I need to get them back before they go too far, but I can't leave you alone. Fire the warning shots. Get Thomas and the others here." Margaret's training kicked in. She grabbed the rifle, checked that it was loaded, and fired 3 shots in rapid succession, pausing, then 3 more. The signal for help. Then she ran to get Willow from the corral, mounting awkwardly while holding Clara against her chest. "What are you doing?" Jack demanded. "I'm coming with you. We're faster together, and I'm not staying here alone wondering if you're safe." Her voice left no room for argument. "Clara will be fine tied to my back in a sling. Let's go." They rode hard toward the canyon, and what Margaret saw when they arrived made her blood run cold. The fence wasn't just cut. It was destroyed, posts pulled completely out of the ground, wire tangled and torn. And beyond it, at least 20 of Jack's cattle were wandering into the treacherous rocky terrain where they could easily be injured or lost. "You go right, I'll go left," Jack called. "Just turn them back toward the opening. Don't try to rope them. Too dangerous with Clara on your back." They split up, Margaret guiding Willow along the canyon rim with her knees, using her voice to call the cattle back. The mare was steady and sure-footed, responding to Margaret's inexperienced commands with patient intelligence. Slowly, painfully, they began turning the herd back toward safer ground. Then Margaret heard the sound of more hoofbeats and looked up to see Thomas Morrison riding hard toward them, followed by his eldest son and 2 of the Fletcher boys. Relief flooded through her. They weren't alone. Working together, they rounded up the scattered cattle and drove them back through the destroyed fence line. Jack's face was dark with fury as he surveyed the damage. "This was deliberate," Thomas said, dismounting to examine the pulled posts. "And recent, maybe an hour ago, no more. You see anyone?" "No one." Jack's hands were clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. "They did this to send a message, to show they can get to my herd anytime they want." "Then we send a message back," one of the Fletcher boys said, young and hot-tempered. "We ride to the Double L and what?" Thomas interrupted sharply. "Start a range war? Get people killed? That's exactly what Lawson wants. An excuse to bring in the law on his side, claim we're the aggressors." "So we just take it?" Jack's voice was raw with frustration. "Let him destroy everything I've built?" "No. We document it, we repair it, and we double our patrols." Thomas's voice was firm but sympathetic. "I know it galls you, son, but we have to be smarter than him, not just tougher." They spent the rest of the day repairing the fence line, working in shifts so that someone was always watching for trouble. Margaret helped where she could, holding posts steady while the men hammered them into the hard ground, Clara strapped to her back the whole time. By evening, the fence was restored, stronger than before, and Jack had moved the cattle to a closer pasture where they'd be easier to monitor. That night, exhausted and discouraged, Jack and Margaret collapsed into bed without bothering with supper. Jack pulled Margaret against him, holding her so tightly it almost hurt. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair. "I brought you into this mess. You should be safe and happy, not living in fear of what might happen next. Stop apologizing for things that aren't your fault." Margaret turned to face him in the darkness. "Yes, I'm scared. Yes, this is hard. But Jack, I chose this life with you, for better or worse, remember? This is the worst part, and I'm not going anywhere. What if something happens to you or Clara because of me? What if something wonderful happens because we stood our ground? What if we win and we get to build our life here without this shadow hanging over us?" Margaret cupped his face, feeling the stubble rough against her palms. "Don't let fear steal our joy. Don't let Lawson take more than he's already trying to take." Jack was quiet for a long moment, then she felt him nod against her. "You're right. We keep living. We keep fighting. We keep hoping." "Exactly." Margaret kissed him softly. "And we do it together." The attacks continued sporadically over the following weeks, small acts of sabotage designed to wear them down. A water trough poisoned, requiring them to dump it and scrub it clean. A gate left open, forcing them to spend hours tracking down wandering horses. Supplies stolen from the barn. Each incident was small enough to deny, serious enough to cause real problems, and clearly coordinated to maximize stress and fear. But the community held firm. Neighbors took turns staying overnight at the most vulnerable ranches. Women learned to shoot and ride patrol. Everyone documented every incident, building a case should they ever get access to authorities who might actually investigate. And slowly, gradually, they adapted to living under siege, not giving in to fear, but acknowledging danger and planning around it. Margaret found unexpected strength she hadn't known she possessed. She learned to reload a rifle in under 10 seconds, to spot signs of tampering from 100 yards away, to sleep lightly enough that any unusual sound would wake her. She also learned to steal joy from small moments. Clara's first attempts at crawling, a spectacular sunset shared with Jack on the porch, Helen's terrible jokes during evening patrols. Life under threat was still life, and she refused to let Lawson steal her capacity for happiness. 6 weeks after the first attack, Jack rode into Copper Creek for supplies and came back with unexpected news. He found Margaret in the kitchen making bread, flour dusting her arms up to the elbows, and swept her into an embrace that lifted her clear off her feet. "What's happened?" she demanded, laughing at his enthusiasm. "Did you win the lottery?" "Better. I talked to the telegraph operator. Apparently there's a federal marshal coming through the territory next month, investigating land fraud and intimidation tactics. Someone filed a formal complaint about Lawson's methods, and the government's finally taking notice." Hope surged through Margaret's chest. "Does Lawson know?" "If he doesn't yet, he will soon. Margaret, if we can hold out until the marshal gets here, if we can present evidence of what he's been doing—" Jack's eyes were bright with the first real optimism she'd seen in weeks. "We might actually win this." "Then we hold out." Margaret gripped his hands. "Whatever it takes. 1 more month." But Lawson must have gotten word of the marshal's impending visit, because 2 days later, the attacks escalated dramatically. Margaret was hanging laundry when she smelled smoke. She turned to see flames licking up the side of the barn, fed by what looked like oil-soaked rags piled against the weathered wood. "Fire!" she screamed, already running. "Jack, fire!" She grabbed the first bucket she could reach, filled it at the pump, and threw water on the flames, knowing even as she did so that it wouldn't be enough. The barn was old, dry, perfect kindling. If it caught fully, they'd lose everything, the horses, the tack, half their tools and supplies. Jack came running from the far field, and together they fought the blaze with desperate efficiency. Margaret pumped water while Jack threw buckets on the flames, both of them moving in frantic synchronicity. The heat was overwhelming, smoke stinging her eyes and choking her lungs, but she kept pumping, kept passing full buckets, kept refusing to give up. They were losing the battle when she heard hoofbeats and looked up to see Helen Morrison galloping toward them, followed by half a dozen riders. The community had seen the smoke and come running. With more hands to help, they managed to beat back the flames before the barn was completely destroyed. The entire east wall was charred and would need rebuilding, and they'd lost some hay and equipment, but the horses were safe and the structure was salvageable. Jack stood staring at the damage, his face black with soot, his chest heaving with exhaustion. Then he turned and pulled Margaret into his arms, holding her with shaking hands. "That's it," he said hoarsely. "I'm taking you and Clara to the Morrisons tomorrow. You stay there until this is over. I won't risk you anymore." "No." Margaret pulled back to look at him. "We stay together. That's what marriage means, Jack. We face this together or not at all." "Margaret, no." Her voice was iron. "I won't be sent away like some helpless damsel while you face danger alone. We're partners. We're a team. And we're going to end this together." The look in his eyes was equal parts love and desperation, but finally he nodded. "Together then. But we end this soon. I can't take much more of watching you in danger." "1 month," Margaret said firmly. "We can survive anything for 1 month." The month that followed tested them in ways Margaret had never imagined. The attacks came with increasing frequency and intensity, each one more brazen than the last. Lawson was clearly trying to break them before the marshal arrived, to force Jack into selling or abandoning his land out of sheer exhaustion and fear. But every attempt to drive them away only strengthened Margaret's resolve and deepened the bond between her and Jack. They fell into a rhythm born of necessity. Jack worked the ranch during daylight hours, never straying far from the house, while Margaret kept watch with the rifle always within reach. At night, they took turns on patrol, one sleeping while the other monitored the property from the porch or rode the fence lines. Clara learned to sleep through her parents' comings and goings, and Margaret marveled at how adaptable the baby was, how she seemed to sense she needed to be quiet and good during the tense daylight hours. The community's support never wavered. Helen came by 3 times a week with fresh bread and company, her presence a reminder that they weren't fighting alone. Thomas and his sons rode patrol several nights a week, giving Jack and Margaret precious hours of rest. The other holdout families shared intelligence about Lawson's movements and tactics, building a network of resistance that grew stronger even as the pressure increased. 2 weeks before the marshal was due to arrive, Margaret woke in the deepest part of night to find Jack's side of the bed empty. She sat up, heart pounding, and heard voices outside, low and urgent. Grabbing her robe and the rifle, she crept to the window and saw Jack talking to Thomas Morrison in the moonlight, both men's postures tense. She slipped outside, and both men turned at the sound of the door. "What's happened?" she asked, already knowing it was something serious from their expressions. Thomas's face was grim in the pale light. "The Coopers sold. Lawson came to them this evening with a new offer, double what he'd offered before, but he also brought proof that their eldest son had been involved in some trouble back in Kansas, said he'd make sure the law came looking unless they sold and left the territory." Margaret felt her stomach drop. The Coopers were one of their strongest allies, a family with 3 grown sons who'd been instrumental in organizing the patrols. "Blackmail. That's about the size of it," Thomas confirmed. "They're leaving at the end of the week, and if Lawson could dig up dirt on the Coopers, he's probably investigating all of us. Looking for leverage." Jack's jaw was tight with fury and frustration. "How many does that leave?" 6 families still holding out. Us, you, the Jamesons, the Fletchers, the Blackwoods, and the Hayes family. But Margaret— Thomas hesitated, then continued. "Lawson's men have been asking questions in Copper Creek. About you. About where you came from." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on the present danger that she hadn't considered how her own past might be weaponized against them. "What kind of questions?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "About whether you and Jack were really married or if you just claimed to be. About whether you were really Anderson's mail-order bride. About—" Thomas looked uncomfortable. "About whether the baby is yours or if you stole her from somewhere." White-hot rage flooded through Margaret, momentarily overwhelming her fear. "That baby is my sister's child. I have her birth certificate and my sister's death certificate. I have proof of everything." "I know that, and Jack knows that. But Lawson doesn't care about truth. He cares about creating enough scandal and doubt that the community turns against you." Thomas's expression was sympathetic but realistic. Out here, reputation is everything. If he convinces people you're not respectable, that Jack married a woman of questionable character, it could undermine all the support you've been getting. Jack moved to Margaret's side, his arm coming around her shoulders. Then we tell our story first. We get ahead of whatever lies Lawson's planning to spread. We make sure everyone knows the truth before he has a chance to twist it. That means being vulnerable, Thomas warned, sharing things that might be painful or private. Margaret thought about Emily's death, about the shame and ostracism they'd faced in Boston, about the desperate journey west that had brought her here. Those were her wounds, her scars, her private grief. The thought of exposing them to public scrutiny made her feel physically ill. But then she thought about what she stood to lose if she let fear silence her. This home, this marriage, this life she and Jack were building together. All of it could be destroyed by lies if she wasn't brave enough to speak truth first. When? She asked simply. Sunday service, Thomas said. Reverend Thompson's a good man. If you stand up in front of the whole congregation and tell your story honestly, people will listen. And more importantly, they'll remember the truth when Lawson's lies start spreading. The next 3 days felt interminable. Margaret practiced what she would say, but every version felt either too defensive or too self-pitying. Jack held her while she cried over having to expose her sister's memory to public examination, and reminded her that Emily would be proud of her courage. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, mocking the turmoil in Margaret's chest. She dressed carefully in her best dress, the blue calico she'd been married in, and pinned her hair up with extra care, as though armor of respectability could protect her from judgment. Jack wore his Sunday clothes and held Clara, who was dressed in a white gown that Helen had brought over the day before. You don't have to do this, Jack said as they prepared to leave. We can find another way. No, we can't. This is the right move. Margaret straightened his collar, needing something to do with her shaking hands. Besides, I'm tired of being afraid, tired of hiding. If our community is going to stand with us, they deserve to know the truth. The church in Riverton was more crowded than Margaret had ever seen it. Word had clearly spread that something significant was happening, and curiosity had drawn even families who rarely attended services. Margaret saw Helen and Thomas in their usual pew, saving space for her and Jack. She also saw several faces she didn't recognize, likely Lawson's people, there to gather ammunition for whatever campaign he was planning. Reverend Thompson's sermon was about truth and courage, and Margaret wondered if Thomas had spoken to him beforehand. When the final hymn ended and the Reverend asked if anyone had anything to share with the congregation, Jack stood up, still holding Clara. My wife has something she'd like to say, he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the small church. I'd appreciate it if everyone would listen with open hearts. Margaret rose on shaking legs and made her way to the front of the church. Every eye was on her, some friendly, some curious, some openly skeptical. She saw Mrs. Kimball from the boarding house, the shopkeeper who'd been dismissive when she first arrived, several ranch families she recognized from community meetings, and in the back, 3 men she didn't know, but who radiated the cold assessment of hired investigators. She took a breath and began. My name is Margaret Carter, though I was born Margaret Ellis in Boston, Massachusetts. I came to Arizona Territory 2 months ago as a mail-order bride, expecting to marry a rancher named Peter Anderson. But Mr. Anderson had lied about everything. His ranch, his circumstances, his intentions. When I arrived in Copper Creek with my 6-month-old niece, I found myself abandoned with almost no money and no prospects. Her voice wavered slightly, but she pushed on. The baby I care for, Clara, is my sister Emily's daughter. Emily died in childbirth, victim of a married man who seduced her with promises and then abandoned her when she became pregnant. The stress and shame of it caused complications that killed her. Before she died, she made me promise to care for Clara, to give her a life free of the stigma that had destroyed Emily's. Margaret's eyes found Jack in the congregation, and his steady gaze gave her strength to continue. I came west hoping to provide that life for Clara. Instead, I found myself stranded and desperate. Jack Carter offered me shelter when I had nowhere else to turn. He treated me with respect and kindness when I had every reason to expect neither. He asked nothing of me except that I take the time I needed to recover from my ordeal and decide what I wanted to do next. She paused, making sure she had everyone's attention. I fell in love with him, Not because he rescued me, but because he showed me what a good man looks like, what honor and integrity and genuine kindness look like. We married because we chose each other, not out of desperation or convenience, but out of love. Now there are people who want to destroy what we're building, people who want to spread lies about my character, about our marriage, about whether I'm a fit guardian for Clara. They want to do this because my husband refuses to be intimidated into selling his land. Margaret's voice grew stronger, fueled by righteous anger. I'm not going to let them. So I'm standing here in front of all of you telling you the truth, the whole truth, including the parts that are painful and private. Because truth is stronger than lies, and I'd rather face judgment for reality than condemnation for fiction. She looked around the church, meeting eyes directly. I'm not perfect. I've made mistakes. But I love my husband. I love my daughter. Yes, Clara is my daughter in every way that matters, and I will fight with everything I have to protect our home and our community. If anyone wants to know more about my past, you can ask me directly. I won't hide anymore. The church was utterly silent when she finished. Margaret walked back to her seat, her legs feeling like water, and sank down beside Jack. He took her hand and squeezed it hard, his eyes bright with unshed tears of pride. Then Helen Morrison stood up. I've known Jack Carter since he was a boy, she said, her voice ringing with authority. And I've gotten to know Margaret over these past weeks. What she just did, standing up here and speaking truth when lies would be easier, that takes more courage than most of us will ever be called on to show. I, for one, stand with the Carters. Thomas stood beside his wife, as do I. One by one, other families rose. The Jamesons, the Fletchers, the Hayes family. Even families Margaret didn't know, ranchers who'd heard about their stand against Lawson and respected their refusal to be bullied. Within moments, more than half the congregation was standing in a silent show of support. Reverend Thompson smiled from the pulpit. I think that's about as clear an answer as anyone could ask for. Mrs. Carter, welcome to our community. We're honored to have you. After the service, Margaret was surrounded by people wanting to shake her hand or offer words of encouragement. Mrs. Kimball approached with tears in her eyes. I owe you an apology, the landlady said stiffly. I was quick to judge when you first arrived, and I was wrong. You've got more character in your little finger than most folks have in their whole bodies. Thank you, Margaret said, genuinely touched. That means a great deal. But as people filtered out of the church, she noticed the three men from the back row talking to a well-dressed couple she recognized as the Hendersons, the family who'd sold to Lawson after their son was beaten. The conversation looked intense, and Margaret felt a chill of foreboding. Her instinct proved correct. 2 days later, Jack came back from checking the cattle with a newspaper in his hand and rage written across his face. He slammed the paper down on the kitchen table where Margaret was kneading bread. Lawson bought the newspaper in Copper Creek. This is what he's printing. Margaret wiped her flour-covered hands and picked up the paper, her heart sinking as she read the headline. Question of character, local rancher's wife's troubled past revealed. The article was a masterpiece of innuendo and half-truths, taking the facts Margaret had shared and twisting them into something sordid. It questioned whether Clara was really her niece, or perhaps her own illegitimate child. It suggested that Jack had been taken in by a scheming woman of questionable morals. It painted Margaret as everything from a confidence artist to a woman of loose virtue. They're destroying me, Margaret whispered, the newspaper trembling in her hands. Everything I said in church. Everything I tried to do, he's using it against us. Jack pulled her into his arms, his own fury palpable in the tension of his body. No, he's trying to destroy you, but he won't succeed. Everyone who matters heard the truth from your own lips. Some printed lies from a man everyone knows is corrupt can't undo that. But the article did damage nonetheless. Over the next few days, Margaret felt the weight of stares and whispers when she went into town for supplies. Some people were openly supportive, making a point of speaking to her warmly and loudly. Others avoided her gaze, and she could see uncertainty in their expressions. The poison of doubt had been planted, and even those who wanted to believe her couldn't help but wonder. The strain showed in Jack's face, in the tightness around his mouth, and the shadows under his eyes. He was working himself to exhaustion, trying to maintain the ranch, protect Margaret and Clara, and support the other families still resisting Lawson's pressure. Margaret watched him gradually wearing down under the weight of it all and felt helpless to ease his burden. Then, finally, 3 days before the marshal was scheduled to arrive, everything came to a head. Margaret was in the garden with Clara when she heard the thunder of approaching horses. Too many horses, coming too fast. She snatched up the baby and ran for the house, where the rifle was always ready. Jack came racing from the barn, and they met at the porch just as a group of at least 15 riders crested the rise. Robert Lawson was at their head, flanked by his hired men. But he wasn't alone. Behind him rode several other men Margaret didn't recognize, along with the county sheriff, a portly man named Dodson, who everyone knew was in Lawson's pocket. "Jack Carter," Lawson called out, reining his horse to a stop 20 feet from the house. "I'm here to make one final offer. Sell me this land today, right now, and you can walk away with enough money to start fresh somewhere else. Your wife won't have to deal with any more unpleasant rumors, and you won't have to worry about what might happen in the days ahead." "The answer's the same as it's always been," Jack said, his voice hard. "No. This land isn't for sale and we're not going anywhere." "That's unfortunate." Lawson turned to Sheriff Dodson. "Sheriff, I believe you have some business with Mrs. Carter?" Dodson dismounted with obvious reluctance, pulling a folded paper from his coat. "Mrs. Carter, I have a warrant here for your arrest. You're charged with child abduction, taking a minor across state lines without proper legal authority." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Margaret clutched Clara tighter, her mind reeling. "That's absurd. Clara is my niece. I have her birth certificate, my sister's death certificate, everything proving my legal guardianship." "The warrant says otherwise," Dodson said, not meeting her eyes. "Claims you took the child from her father's custody without permission. You'll need to come with me while the courts sort it out." "Her father?" Margaret's voice rose with incredulous fury. "Her father was a married man who denied the child was his, who destroyed my sister's reputation and drove her to an early grave. He has no rights to Clara." "That's for a judge to decide, ma'am. I'm just serving the warrant." Jack stepped between Margaret and the sheriff, his whole body radiating barely controlled violence. "You're not taking my wife anywhere. This is clearly a fabricated charge designed to intimidate us into selling our land." "Interfering with the execution of a legal warrant is a crime, Mr. Carter," Lawson said smoothly. "Don't make this worse than it has to be." "This is a setup, and everyone knows it." Jack's voice was dangerous. "That warrant is as fake as the accusations against my wife." "The warrant bears the seal of a Massachusetts court," Dodson said, still not meeting anyone's eyes. "I'm legally bound to execute it." Margaret's mind was racing. If they arrested her, they'd take Clara. Even if the charges were eventually dismissed, the process could take weeks or months. Clara would be placed with strangers, possibly even sent back to Boston to a father who'd never wanted her. And Jack would be left alone, vulnerable, facing Lawson's threats without her support. Unless this was all a bluff designed to break them. "Show me the warrant," Margaret said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension. "Let me see it." Dodson hesitated, then handed it over. Margaret scanned the document quickly, her heart pounding. It looked official, the right seals, the proper legal language, but something about it felt wrong, though she couldn't immediately place what. Then she saw it. The date on the judge's signature was wrong, listed as 3 weeks in the future. A simple forger's mistake, but a telling one. "This warrant is a forgery," Margaret announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The signature date hasn't happened yet. Unless Massachusetts has judges who can see the future, this document is worthless." Dodson snatched the paper back, his face flushing red as he examined it. His expression confirmed what Margaret had suspected. He hadn't looked at the warrant closely, had simply accepted it from Lawson without question. "This doesn't change anything," Lawson said quickly, but Margaret could hear the edge of desperation in his voice. "Even if that particular warrant is flawed, the charges are real. Mrs. Carter can be arrested on suspicion. On what grounds?" A new voice interrupted. "I'm very curious to hear your answer, Mr. Lawson." Everyone turned to see a man riding up the path from the opposite direction. A lean, weathered man in his 50s wearing a Marshal star on his vest. Behind him rode Thomas Morrison and his 3 sons, all armed and looking grimly determined. "Marshal Hawkins," the man said, touching his hat brim to Margaret. "I arrived a few days early when I heard Robert Lawson was accelerating his campaign of intimidation in this area. I've been staying with the Morrisons, gathering evidence." He turned to Lawson, his expression hard. and I believe I've gathered quite enough." Lawson's face had gone pale, but he rallied quickly. "Marshal, I'm simply trying to help the sheriff execute a legal warrant." "A forged warrant," Hawkins corrected, "which is a federal crime, particularly when used to facilitate land fraud and intimidation. I've been investigating your activities for the past 6 months, Mr. Lawson, and I have testimony from over 24 families about your tactics. Threats, property destruction, assault, arson, blackmail, quite an impressive list of crimes." "You can't prove any of that," Lawson said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Actually, I can. Mrs. Morrison has been documenting every incident in this area with dates, times, and witnesses. Several of your former employees have agreed to testify in exchange for leniency. And I have a very interesting conversation recorded between you and Sheriff Dodson about fabricating charges against Mrs. Carter." Hawkins smiled grimly. "One of your own men turned out to have a conscience and a good memory for details." Margaret watched Lawson's face cycle through emotions: shock, fury, calculation, and finally, defeat. His whole carefully constructed plan was falling apart, undone by the very community he'd tried to terrorize into submission. "Sheriff Dodson," Hawkins continued, "you're under arrest for corruption and abuse of office. Mr. Lawson, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, multiple counts of intimidation and assault, and attempted extortion. Gentlemen," he nodded to the Morrison boys, who moved forward to disarm Lawson's hired men. Most of them surrendered immediately, clearly having no loyalty worth going to jail for. The entire confrontation, which had seemed poised to destroy everything Margaret and Jack had built, collapsed in a matter of minutes. Lawson and Dodson were bound and placed under guard. Their hired men were questioned and released with warnings. And through it all, Jack stood with his arm around Margaret, holding her and Clara close, as though he couldn't quite believe they were safe. When the prisoners had been secured and most of the crowd dispersed, Marshal Hawkins approached Margaret and Jack. "I apologize that it took so long to intervene," he said, "but I needed enough evidence to make charges stick, and that meant watching Lawson escalate his tactics. I know it put you folks in real danger." "It's over now," Jack said, his voice rough with emotion. "That's what matters." "You should know," Hawkins continued, "that your stand helped us immensely. If all the families had folded, there'd be nothing to investigate. Your courage in resisting made it possible to build a case." He tipped his hat to Margaret. "And ma'am, that speech you gave in church? That's what broke things open. Several of Lawson's men heard about it and realized they were working for someone willing to destroy an innocent woman and her child. That's when we started getting cooperation from inside his organization." After Hawkins left, Margaret and Jack simply stood on their porch, holding each other and Clara, watching the sun climb higher in a sky that seemed somehow more blue, more vast, more beautiful than it had in weeks. "It's really over," Margaret whispered. "He can't hurt us anymore." "We won, Maggie. We actually won." Jack buried his face in her hair, his shoulders shaking with released tension. "God, I was so scared I was going to lose you." "You're not getting rid of me that easily," Margaret said, pulling back to smile at him through her tears. "I told you, for better or worse, through everything, I meant it." They spent the rest of that day slowly returning to normal life, or what passed for normal after weeks of living under siege. Jack checked on the cattle while Margaret cleaned the house, tackling chores that had been neglected during the crisis. That evening, the Morrisons came over for supper, along with the Fletcher and Jameson families, and they celebrated with food and music and laughter that felt almost defiant in its joy. "To the Carters," Thomas said, raising his glass, "who stood their ground when it would have been easier to run, and reminded all of us what real courage looks like." The following weeks brought a gradual return to peace. Lawson was tried and convicted on multiple counts, sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. Sheriff Dodson was stripped of his badge and given a lighter sentence in exchange for testimony against Lawson. The other families who'd been pressured to sell came back, reclaiming their land or purchasing new parcels, rebuilding the community that Lawson had tried to destroy. Margaret and Jack settled into the rhythm of married life, the kind of everyday domesticity that had seemed impossible during the crisis. They repaired the barn, working side by side to rebuild what had been burned. They added new chickens to the coop and planted a larger garden. Jack brought home 2 more horses he'd gotten for a good price, and Margaret learned to ride well enough to help move cattle when needed. Clara grew rapidly, her personality blossoming in the stable, loving environment. She learned to sit up on her own, then to crawl with determined enthusiasm across the worn wooden floors. Her laughter filled the house, and both Jack and Margaret marveled at how such a small person could bring so much joy. One evening in early autumn, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret felt Jack's hand move to rest on her stomach. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said quietly. Margaret covered his hand with hers, warmth flooding through her. "I was going to tell you tonight. I'm certain now we're going to have a baby. Due sometime in early spring, I think." Jack's face cycled through shock, joy, and wonder in rapid succession. "A baby. Our baby." His voice cracked with emotion. "Maggie, are you all right?" "I'm perfect. We're perfect." Margaret turned to face him fully, taking in the sight of his joy-struck expression. "I went to see Doc Patterson in Riverton last week. He confirmed it and said everything looks healthy and normal." "We're going to have a baby," Jack repeated, as though he couldn't quite believe it. Then he was kissing her deep and sweet and full of promise, his hands cradling her face with infinite tenderness. "God, Margaret, you've given me everything. A home that feels like home. Love I never thought I'd find. And now a child, our child. How did I get so lucky?" "We both got lucky," Margaret corrected. "We found each other when we both needed finding." They told Clara the news first, even though she was too young to understand, both of them wanting her to know she'd always been first in their hearts. Then they rode to the Morrisons to share their joy, and Helen cried happy tears while Thomas clapped Jack on the back and declared this called for his best whiskey. The months that followed were the happiest of Margaret's life. Her body changed and grew, and Jack was endlessly fascinated by every development, talking to her growing belly and feeling for movement with gentle, reverent hands. He built a cradle during the long winter evenings, working the wood with patient care, determined that their child would have something beautiful to sleep in. Margaret sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands moving with practiced skill while Clara played at her feet. Christmas came, and they invited Helen and Thomas for dinner, along with several other families from the community. The house was full of laughter and warmth, and Margaret stood in the doorway of her kitchen watching the scene, Jack holding Clara and making her giggle, Helen telling some outrageous story, Thomas carving the turkey with ceremonial precision, and felt her heart might burst with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered to whatever force had guided her west, to the sister watching over her from beyond, to the universe that had brought her to this place and this man. In March, as the desert began to bloom with spring wildflowers, Margaret went into labor. Jack rode for Doc Patterson while Helen stayed with Margaret, coaching her through contractions with the calm authority of someone who'd done this many times. The labor was long but uncomplicated, and when their son finally arrived in the early hours of the morning, Margaret cradled him against her chest and felt a completion she'd never imagined possible. "He's perfect," Jack whispered, his fingers gently touching the baby's downy head. "Absolutely perfect. What should we call him?" "Henry," Margaret said without hesitation. "After your father, Henry James Carter." Jack's eyes filled with tears. "My pa would have loved that. Would have loved you." He kissed her forehead, then the baby's. "Thank you, Maggie. For this. For everything." Claire was fascinated by her new brother, wanting to help with everything from diaper changes to feeding time. She would sit beside Margaret while the baby nursed, patting his head gently and singing nonsense songs in her babbling voice. Watching her, Margaret thought about Emily and how proud her sister would be to see the life Clara was living, safe, loved, surrounded by family. As spring turned to summer and Henry grew from a tiny newborn to a chubby, happy infant, the ranch thrived. Jack expanded the herd with the money saved from not having to pay protection or deal with Lawson's sabotage. They hired a young man from town to help with the heavy work, giving Jack more time to spend with his growing family. Margaret's garden flourished, providing more vegetables than they could eat themselves, so she started preserving them and trading the surplus with neighbors. One evening in late summer, nearly a year after Margaret had stepped off that stagecoach in Copper Creek feeling lost and abandoned, she and Jack sat on their porch watching the children play. Clara was teaching Henry to clap hands, her patience with her baby brother endless and sweet. The sun was setting in a blaze of glory, and the desert air carried the scent of sage and possibility. "Penny for your thoughts?" Jack asked, his arm around her shoulders. Margaret leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body against hers. "I was thinking about the day we met, how desperate and afraid I was, how certain I was that my life was over. And now? Now I know that sometimes you have to lose your way completely to find where you truly belong." She looked up at him, this man who'd offered her shelter and given her a home, who'd promised her safety and given her love, who'd stood beside her through danger and built a life with her in peace. "I came west looking for security. I found so much more." Jack pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Sometimes the best things in life are the ones we never knew to hope for." "Like unexpected blessings," Margaret said, thinking of his mother's ring on her finger, the pearl glowing soft in the fading light. "Exactly like that." Jack's voice was warm with contentment. "Things that change everything when they arrive." As twilight settled over the ranch and stars began to emerge in the vast Arizona sky, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The pain and loss, the fear and struggle, the moment of grace when a cowboy with kind eyes had said, "You look like you could use a hand," and changed the course of her life forever. She'd been lost, abandoned, desperate with no clear path forward. And Jack Carter had done exactly what he'd promised. He'd led her home. Not just to a physical place, but to a sense of belonging she'd never known before. To a love that asked for nothing and gave everything. To a life built on trust and partnership and the courage to hope, even when hope seemed foolish. Clara's laughter rang out across the yard as she succeeded in getting Henry to clap, and both children turned to their parents with matching expressions of delight. Jack waved to them, his face alight with love, and Margaret felt the last shadows of her old fears finally, completely dissolve. This was home. This ranch with its weathered boards and hard-won peace. This family built from loss and sealed with love. This man beside her who'd seen her at her most vulnerable and chosen to shelter rather than exploit, to honor rather than use, to love rather than judge. "I'm glad I got lost," Margaret said softly, echoing words she'd spoken before. "Because it led me to you." Jack turned to face her, cupping her cheek in his calloused palm. "And I'm glad I was there to find you. Though honestly, Maggie, I think you'd already found yourself. You just needed a place to stand while you remembered how strong you'd always been." As the first stars wheeled overhead and the desert night sang its ancient lullaby, Margaret Carter sat surrounded by everything she'd once thought impossible: safety, love, family, home. The mail-order bride who'd been abandoned had become the heart of a thriving ranch, the mother of 2 beautiful children, and the beloved wife of a man who saw her strength even when she couldn't see it herself. She'd traveled thousands of miles searching for security and found instead a love that made her brave. She'd arrived broken and been made whole. She'd stood on a dusty street with a crying baby and a heart full of fear, and a cowboy had said, "I'll lead you home." And he had. Oh, how beautifully he had. The end.